Every moment of your life, whether awake or asleep, your body performs an extraordinary feat that requires no conscious thought breathing. This automatic rhythm sustains every cell, powers every heartbeat, and enables every word you speak. Right now, as you settle in to listen, your diaphragm is silently contracting, drawing air through an intricate network of passages into microscopic chambers where the alchemy of life unfolds. Oxygen slips across impossibly thin membranes into your bloodstream, while carbon dioxide makes the return journey, each exchange happening thousands of times without your awareness. Tonight, we'll explore the remarkable machinery that keeps this vital process running seamlessly, from your first breath to your last. Imagine, if you will, that you could shrink yourself down and follow a single molecule of oxygen on its journey from the world outside your body to the deepest recesses of your lungs. This voyage would take you through one of nature's most elegant architectural marvels, the human respiratory system. Like a magnificent cathedral designed with perfect acoustics, every passage, every branching pathway, every surface has been shaped by millions of years of evolution to serve the single purpose of moving air with maximum efficiency and safety. The journey begins at the very threshold between your internal world and the atmosphere around you. Your nostrils, those unassuming oval openings, are far more sophisticated than they appear. As our oxygen molecule approaches, it encounters the first line of the respiratory system's defenses. Coarse hairs, growing from the inner walls of the nostrils, act like a security checkpoint, filtering out the largest particles: dust, pollen, small insects, anything that might pose a threat to the delicate structures deeper within. But the nostrils do more than simply provide an entrance. Notice how they're positioned downward and slightly inward. This isn't accident, but design. This orientation helps prevent rain and debris from entering directly, while the curved shape creates a gentle turbulence that begins the process of conditioning the incoming air. In cold weather, you've likely noticed how your nose seems to work harder, perhaps becoming congested or producing more mucus. This is your respiratory system responding to the additional challenge of warming frigid air to body temperature before it reaches your lungs. Passing through the nostrils, our oxygen molecule enters the nasal cavity, a space far more complex than its external simplicity suggests. The nasal cavity is divided by the nasal septum, that wall of cartilage and bone that creates two parallel passageways. This division serves multiple purposes. It provides structural support, creates two separate air streams that can be independently regulated, and offers backup functionality should one side become blocked. The walls of the nasal cavity are lined with a specialized tissue called respiratory epithelium, a living carpet of cells that performs three critical functions simultaneously. First, it warms the incoming air through an extensive network of blood vessels lying just beneath the surface. These vessels can dilate or constrict to adjust the amount of heat transfer, ensuring that even Arctic air reaches body temperature by the time it moves deeper into the respiratory tract. Second, this same epithelium moisturizes the air through thousands of tiny mucus-producing cells called goblet cells. The mucus they secrete isn't merely protective, it's a sophisticated biological solution containing antimicrobial substances, immune cells, and enzymes that begin the process of neutralizing potential threats. The moisture content is precisely regulated. Too little, and the delicate tissues downstream would dry out and crack. Too much, and the air would become saturated, interfering with gas exchange. Third, and perhaps most importantly, The nasal cavity filters the air through both mechanical and chemical means. The turbulent airflow created by three shelf-like projections called nasal conchae or turbinates forces air into contact with the mucus-coated surfaces. Here, particles are trapped and potential pathogens are exposed to immune defenses. The conchae also increase the surface area available for warming and humidifying, much like the radiator fins in a car increase heat exchange efficiency. As our oxygen molecule travels deeper, it encounters another remarkable feature of nasal architecture, the olfactory region. Hidden in the upper reaches of the nasal cavity lies a small patch of specialized tissue responsible for our sense of smell. Millions of olfactory receptor neurons sample the chemical composition of incoming air, providing not just the experience of scent, but also serving as an early warning system for dangerous gases or spoiled food. From the nasal cavity, air moves into the pharynx, a region where the respiratory and digestive systems briefly share common space. The pharynx, often called the throat, is divided into three regions, each with distinct characteristics. The nasopharynx sits behind the nasal cavity and remains dedicated to breathing. Here, the eustachian tubes connect to the middle ears, explaining why a stuffy nose can affect your hearing and why yawning or swallowing can sometimes relieve ear pressure during altitude changes. The oropharynx lies behind the mouth and serves double duty, accommodating both breathing and swallowing. This shared function requires precise coordination. A split-second mistake in timing could send food or liquid down the wrong path, toward the lungs instead of the stomach. The laryngopharynx, the lowest section, continues this dual role until the pathways finally separate at the entrance to the larynx. The larynx, commonly known as the voice box, represents one of the most sophisticated structures in the respiratory tract. Far more than a simple passageway, the larynx is a complex organ that serves as gatekeeper, protector, and sound generator all at once. Its framework consists of several cartilages, the largest being the thyroid cartilage that forms the Adam's apple. These cartilages are connected by muscles and ligaments that allow for precise adjustments in the size and shape of the laryngeal opening. At the heart of the larynx lie the vocal cords, two bands of tissue that can be brought together or separated to control airflow and create sound. When relaxed and separated, they allow air to pass freely and silently. When tensed and partially closed, they vibrate in the airstream, creating the fundamental tones that become speech and song. The precision required for this function is extraordinary. The vocal cords can make adjustments measured in fractions of millimeters and milliseconds to produce the subtle variations that distinguish one word from another. But perhaps the larynx's most critical function is protection. The epiglottis, a leaf-shaped piece of cartilage, acts as a trapdoor during swallowing. When you swallow, the larynx elevates and the epiglottis folds down over the entrance, temporarily sealing off the respiratory tract and directing food and liquids safely toward the esophagus. This protective mechanism is so vital that it operates reflexively. You couldn't consciously override it if you tried. Below the larynx begins the lower respiratory tract, marked by the entrance to the trachea. The trachea, or windpipe, might seem like a simple tube, but its engineering is remarkably sophisticated. Approximately 4 inches long and about an inch in diameter, it's reinforced by C-shaped rings of cartilage that keep it from collapsing under the pressure changes of breathing, much like the reinforcing wire in a vacuum cleaner hose. The trachea's inner surface continues the filtering and conditioning work begun in the upper respiratory tract. Ciliated epithelium lines the entire tube, with countless microscopic hairs beating in coordinated waves that move mucus and trapped particles upward, away from the lungs. This mucociliary escalator operates continuously, sweeping debris toward the pharynx, where it can be swallowed or expelled. When this system is overwhelmed by infection or irritants, we experience it as the need to cough, a forceful expulsion that clears the airways. At its lower end, the trachea reaches a critical junction called the carina, where it divides into the right and left primary bronchi. This division marks the beginning of the respiratory tree, a branching pattern that will continue to subdivide until it reaches the microscopic level. The angle of this division isn't arbitrary. The right bronchus descends at a steeper angle than the left, which explains why aspirated objects more commonly lodge in the right lung. The bronchi continue the trachea's structural theme, but begin to show modifications suited to their changing role. The cartilage rings become less regular, eventually transitioning to scattered cartilage plates. The bronchi divide repeatedly, creating secondary bronchi that serve individual lung lobes, then tertiary bronchi that supply specific lung segments. With each division, the airways become smaller in diameter, but greater in total number and combined cross-sectional area. As the bronchi continue to branch, they eventually become bronchioles, the smallest airways that still maintain the characteristics of conducting passages. Bronchioles lack cartilage entirely, instead relying on smooth muscle for structural support. This smooth muscle can contract or relax to regulate airflow to different lung regions, a property that becomes critically important during exercise or in response to irritants. When this smooth muscle contracts excessively, as in asthma, breathing becomes labored and wheezing occurs. The conducting airways from nostrils to terminal bronchioles comprise what's known as anatomical dead space. No gas exchange occurs here. These passages serve purely to condition and transport air, yet this apparent inefficiency serves important purposes. The dead space provides time for air conditioning to reach completion, allows for the mixing of fresh air with residual air in the lungs, and creates a reservoir of conditioned air that's immediately available with each breath. This intricate architecture represents more than mere plumbing. Each component of the conducting airways reflects a balance between competing demands, the need for structural integrity versus flexibility, the requirement for protection versus efficiency, the necessity of warming and humidifying air versus maintaining adequate airflow. The result is a system that can process over 10,000 liters of air daily while maintaining the precise conditions necessary for optimal gas exchange. As we trace this pathway from nostrils to bronchioles, we begin to appreciate the remarkable engineering that makes breathing possible. But the conducting airways are merely the gateway to the respiratory system's true destination, the lungs themselves, where the architecture of air gives way to the chemistry of life. If the conducting airways represent the corridors and hallways of the respiratory system, then the lungs are its vast processing chambers, biological factories that never close, never rest, and never fail in their primary mission of gas exchange. These remarkable organs occupy most of the space within your chest cavity, yet they achieve their extraordinary efficiency not through size alone, but through an internal architecture so intricate and extensive that it defies easy comprehension. Picture the lungs nestled within the thoracic cavity like two deflated balloons, though this simple comparison hardly does justice to their complexity. The right lung, larger and more robust, fills the right side of the chest, while the left lung, slightly smaller and shaped to accommodate the heart, occupies the left. Together, they form a paired system with subtle but important differences that reflect the asymmetrical demands of the human body. The right lung is divided into three distinct sections called lobes superior, middle, and inferior, separated by deep fissures that allow each lobe to move somewhat independently during breathing. This three-lobe configuration provides structural stability and creates natural boundaries that limit the spread of infection or injury from one section to another. The horizontal fissure separates the superior and middle lobes, while the oblique fissure divides the middle and inferior lobes. These fissures aren't merely anatomical boundaries, they're functional divisions that allow surgeons to remove diseased sections while preserving healthy lung tissue. The left lung, in contrast, contains only two lobes, superior and inferior, divided by a single oblique fissure. This seemingly simpler arrangement accommodates the heart's position, which tilts slightly to the left and creates an indentation in the left lung called the cardiac notch. This notch isn't an evolutionary oversight, but a precise accommodation that allows the heart and lungs to coexist efficiently within the confined space of the chest cavity. The left lung's smaller size is compensated by its slightly greater length, and both lungs together provide remarkably similar total capacity. Each lung is surrounded by a sophisticated membrane system called the pleura, which serves multiple critical functions. Think of the pleura as a specialized wrapping that both protects the lungs and enables their movement. The visceral pleura forms the outer surface of each lung, adhering so closely that it follows every contour of the lung's surface, dipping into the fissures and coating the finest details of lung architecture. This membrane is richly supplied with blood vessels and nerve endings that monitor lung function and respond to changes in pressure or volume. Surrounding the visceral pleura is the parietal pleura, which lines the inner surface of the chest wall, the upper surface of the diaphragm, and the sides of the mediastinum, the central space that houses the heart and major blood vessels. Between these two pleural layers lies the pleural cavity, a potential space that normally contains only a thin film of pleural fluid. This fluid serves as both lubricant and adhesive, allowing the lungs to slide smoothly against the chest wall during breathing while maintaining the cohesion necessary for efficient ventilation. The pleural cavity's unique properties are essential to breathing mechanics. The pleural fluid creates a surface tension that keeps the lungs expanded and following the movements of the chest wall, much like how a thin layer of water between two glass plates makes them difficult to separate. When the chest wall expands during inspiration, the lungs are pulled along by this pleural adhesion. Conversely, when disease or injury allows air to enter the pleural cavity, a condition called pneumothorax, this adhesion is lost, and the lung can collapse. At the medial surface of each lung lies the hilum, a depression where the major structures enter and exit the lung. The hilum serves as the lung's connection point to the rest of the body, accommodating the primary bronchus, pulmonary arteries and veins, lymphatic vessels, and nerve fibers. This region is reinforced by dense connective tissue that provides structural support for these vital connections. The arrangement of structures within the hilum follows a consistent pattern. The pulmonary artery typically lies superior to the bronchus, while the pulmonary veins occupy the inferior position. From the hilum, the primary bronchus enters the lung and immediately begins its transformation into the respiratory tree, one of nature's most elegant branching patterns. This tree-like structure represents a masterpiece of biological engineering, solving the fundamental challenge of distributing air efficiently throughout the lung's volume while maximizing surface area for gas exchange. The respiratory tree follows a pattern of dichotomous branching, meaning each airway divides into two smaller branches, which themselves divide into two even smaller branches, and so on. This pattern continues for approximately 23 generations, from the trachea to the terminal air sacs. The early generations' primary, secondary, and tertiary bronchi maintain the characteristics of conducting airways, with cartilage support and ciliated epithelium for air conditioning and cleaning. As the airways progress through their branching pattern, they undergo gradual but significant changes in structure and function. The cartilage support transitions from C-shaped rings to irregular plates, then disappears entirely in the smaller bronchioles. Smooth muscle becomes increasingly prominent, providing the ability to regulate airflow to different lung regions based on local oxygen demands or in response to irritants. The epithelium gradually transitions from ciliated columnar cells to simple cuboidal cells, reflecting the changing functional priorities as air moves deeper into the lung. The terminal bronchioles represent the end of the purely conducting portion of the respiratory tree. Beyond this point, the airways begin to participate in gas exchange, marking the transition from the conducting zone to the respiratory zone. This transition isn't abrupt but gradual, with respiratory bronchioles showing the first appearance of alveoli, the microscopic air sacs where gas exchange occurs. The branching pattern of the respiratory tree achieves several important objectives simultaneously. First, it dramatically increases the total cross-sectional area of the airways as they divide, even though each individual airway becomes smaller. This increase in total area reduces air velocity as it moves deeper into the lungs, creating the optimal conditions for gas exchange. Second, the pattern ensures that air reaches all regions of the lung efficiently, with roughly equal distribution to each of the millions of terminal air spaces. Third, the multiple generations of branching provide redundancy and alternative pathways so that blockage of individual airways doesn't completely isolate large lung regions. The lung's blood supply reflects its dual role in gas exchange and tissue nutrition. The pulmonary circulation, which carries deoxygenated blood from the right heart through the lungs and returns oxygenated blood to the left heart, follows the branching pattern of the airways closely. Pulmonary arteries divide alongside the bronchi, creating an intimate relationship between air spaces and blood vessels that optimizes gas exchange efficiency. Additionally, the lungs receive their own nutritional blood supply through the bronchial circulation, which arises from the systemic circulation and supplies the airways, blood vessels, nerves, and connective tissues of the lung. This dual circulation sometimes creates connections between the pulmonary and bronchial systems, providing backup circulation in case of injury or disease. The lymphatic system of the lungs deserves special mention for its role in maintaining lung health and fighting infection. An extensive network of lymphatic vessels and nodes drains fluid and particles from the lung tissues, preventing the accumulation of excess fluid that could interfere with gas exchange. The lymphatic system also serves as a highway for immune cells patrolling the lungs for potential threats. Each lung is segmented not only by the obvious lobar divisions, but also by more subtle bronchopulmonary segments, regions supplied by specific tertiary bronchi and their accompanying blood vessels. These segments are functionally independent units that can be surgically removed if diseased, while preserving the function of surrounding segments. The right lung contains 10 such segments, while the left lung contains 8 to 10, depending on individual variation. The positioning of the lungs within the thoracic cavity reflects careful evolutionary optimization. The lungs extend from just above the clavicles at their apex to the diaphragm at their base, filling nearly all available space within the chest cavity. Their shape changes constantly during breathing, expanding vertically as the diaphragm descends, expanding outward as the rib cage widens, and adapting to the movements of surrounding structures. The lung's surface markings can be traced on the chest wall, providing important landmarks for medical examination and procedures. The upper borders of the lungs lie at the level of the clavicles, while the lower borders follow the curve of the diaphragm, typically reaching the sixth rib anteriorly and the 10th rib posteriorly. These landmarks shift during deep inspiration and expiration, reflecting the lung's remarkable capacity for volume change. The lung's relationship with the diaphragm, the heart, and the chest wall creates a delicate balance of pressures and movements that enables efficient breathing. The diaphragm forms the floor of the thoracic cavity, its dome-shaped muscle fibers radiating outward from a central tendon. During inspiration, the diaphragm contracts and flattens, increasing the vertical dimension of the chest cavity and drawing the lungs downward. The intercostal muscles between the ribs assist by lifting and expanding the rib cage, further increasing chest cavity volume. This mechanical arrangement transforms the lungs into sophisticated bellows that can adjust their volume to meet varying demands. During quiet breathing, the volume changes are modest, involving primarily diaphragmatic movement with minimal rib cage expansion. During exercise or stress, both diaphragmatic and intercostal muscle activity increase dramatically, with additional accessory muscles joining the effort to maximize airflow. The lung's capacity for adaptation extends beyond simple volume changes. They can adjust their internal distribution of airflow based on local conditions, redirecting air away from diseased or poorly functioning regions and toward healthy areas. They can modify their blood flow patterns to match ventilation, ensuring optimal gas exchange efficiency. They can alter their compliance, their ease of expansion in response to changing demands or pathological conditions. As we stand at the threshold between the conducting airways and the gas exchange regions, we begin to appreciate that the lungs represent far more than passive air sacs. They are active, responsive organs capable of sophisticated adjustments that optimize their performance under widely varying conditions. The architecture we've explored, the lobar divisions, pleural membranes, branching airways, and blood supply provides the foundation for the microscopic marvels that await us in the deepest recesses of the respiratory tree, where the true magic of breathing unfolds. Deep within the lungs, at the very end of the respiratory tree's countless branches, lie structures so small they can only be seen under magnification, yet so numerous and efficient that they sustain every moment of your life. These are the alveoli, tiny, balloon-like chambers that represent the culmination of the respiratory system's sophisticated design. If you could somehow gather all 300 million alveoli from both lungs and spread them flat, they would create a surface area roughly the size of a tennis court, all packed into the space of your chest cavity. To truly appreciate the marvel of alveolar design, imagine shrinking down to molecular size and approaching one of these microscopic chambers. What you would encounter defies easy description: a gossamer-thin membrane that separates air from blood by a distance measured in mere tenths of a micrometer. a barrier so delicate that oxygen and carbon dioxide can cross it effortlessly, yet so precisely engineered that it maintains the crucial separation between your internal and external environments. Each alveolus represents a masterpiece of biological miniaturization. These microscopic air sacs cluster together like soap bubbles, sharing walls and creating an intricate honeycomb structure that maximizes surface area while minimizing the distance gases must travel. The walls between adjacent alveoli, called interalveolar septa, are perforated by tiny openings called pores of cone. These microscopic passages serve multiple functions. They allow air to pass between alveoli, ensuring that blockage of a single airway doesn't completely isolate downstream air sacs, and they provide routes for immune cells to patrol throughout the lung tissue. The architecture of an individual alveolus reflects a careful balance between structural integrity and functional efficiency. The alveolar wall consists of several distinct layers, each contributing to the overall function of gas exchange. The innermost layer, facing the airspace, is lined with a thin film of surfactant, a complex mixture of phospholipids, proteins, and other molecules that serves as one of the respiratory system's most crucial innovations. Surfactant deserves particular attention because without it, breathing as we know it would be impossible. The surface tension created by the thin layer of moisture coating the alveolar walls would cause these tiny air sacs to collapse completely, much like how water droplets naturally form spheres due to surface tension. Surfactant dramatically reduces this surface tension, allowing alveoli to remain inflated and stable throughout the breathing cycle. This seemingly simple function requires sophisticated molecular machinery and precise regulation. Surfactant production begins before birth as the developing fetus prepares for the transition from liquid-filled to air-filled lungs. Premature infants sometimes lack adequate surfactant, leading to respiratory distress syndrome, a condition that dramatically illustrates surfactant's critical importance. The development of artificial surfactant for treating this condition represents one of modern medicine's great success stories, transforming the prognosis for premature babies worldwide. The bulk of the alveolar surface is covered by type I pneumocytes, cells so thin and extensive that they cover approximately 95% of the alveolar surface area, despite representing only about 40% of the total cell number. These remarkably flattened cells have evolved for a single purpose: to minimize the barrier between air and blood while maintaining the integrity of the air-blood interface. Type 1 pneumocytes are so thin that in some areas they measure less than 0.1 micrometers in thickness, approaching the theoretical minimum for a living cell membrane. Beneath the pneumocytes lies the basement membrane, a thin but crucial layer that provides structural support for the epithelial cells while serving as part of the filtration barrier. This membrane contains specialized proteins that regulate which molecules can pass between air and blood, helping maintain the delicate balance of the internal environment. The capillary network surrounding each alveolus represents equally impressive engineering. Pulmonary capillaries are among the smallest blood vessels in the body, with diameters so narrow that red blood cells must squeeze through in single file. This intimate contact between blood cells and the alveolar wall ensures optimal gas exchange, but it also creates vulnerability. The same thinness that facilitates gas exchange makes the alveolar capillary membrane susceptible to damage from high pressures, toxic substances, or infection. The endothelial cells lining the pulmonary capillaries have their own specialized features. Like the type I pneumocytes, they are extremely thin and contain numerous transport mechanisms for moving gases and other molecules across the cell membrane. These endothelial cells also produce various substances that regulate blood flow, prevent clotting, and contribute to immune responses within the lung. Between the alveolar epithelium and capillary endothelium lies the interstitium, a thin space containing connective tissue fibers, immune cells, and the lymphatic vessels that drain excess fluid from the lung. Under normal conditions, this space is minimal, but in disease states it can thicken significantly, interfering with gas exchange by increasing the distance oxygen and carbon dioxide must travel. The respiratory membrane, the combined barrier of alveolar epithelium, basement membranes, and capillary endothelium, typically measures only about 0.5 micrometers in thickness. To put this in perspective, this barrier is roughly 200 times thinner than a human hair, yet it must maintain its integrity while allowing billions of gas molecules to cross it every minute. The efficiency of this membrane is such that under normal conditions, the transfer of oxygen and carbon dioxide across it is limited not by the membrane itself, but by the rate of blood flow through the pulmonary capillaries. The efficiency of alveolar gas exchange is enhanced by several factors beyond the thin respiratory membrane. The enormous surface area created by 300 million alveoli provides countless sites for gas exchange to occur simultaneously. The excellent blood supply ensures that fresh venous blood continuously arrives at the gas exchange surface, while oxygenated blood is rapidly carried away. The ventilation of alveoli brings fresh air into contact with the respiratory membrane while removing air depleted of oxygen and enriched with carbon dioxide. Alveolar structure also includes important defense mechanisms that protect these delicate chambers from damage. Alveolar macrophages, large immune cells that patrol the air spaces, engulf and destroy bacteria, particles, and other potential threats that reach the deepest parts of the lung. These cellular guardians can move freely throughout the alveolar spaces, crawling along the walls and through the pores of cone to maintain surveillance over the entire alveolar region. The alveolar capillary membrane must also regulate fluid balance carefully. The starling forces the balance between hydrostatic pressure, pushing fluid out of capillaries, and oncotic pressure, drawing it back in, normally favor keeping the alveoli dry. When this balance is disturbed, as in heart failure or certain infections, fluid can accumulate in the alveolar spaces, severely impairing gas exchange and causing the life-threatening condition known as pulmonary edema. Alveolar stability depends not only on surfactant, but also on the mechanical properties of the surrounding lung tissue. The elastic fibers in the lung parenchyma provide a gentle inward pull that helps maintain alveolar shape, while the interconnected nature of the alveolar structure provides mutual support. When you take a deep breath, the alveoli expand uniformly, and when you exhale, they return to their resting size in a coordinated fashion. The three-dimensional arrangement of alveoli creates an incredibly efficient packing system. Like the cells in a honeycomb, alveoli share walls wherever possible, minimizing the amount of structural material needed while maximizing the enclosed volume. This efficient packing allows the lungs to contain an enormous gas exchange surface within the limited space of the thoracic cavity. Temperature regulation within the alveolar region helps optimize gas exchange. The extensive capillary network not only facilitates gas transfer, but also ensures that the temperature throughout the alveolar region remains constant at body temperature. This thermal stability is crucial because gas solubility and diffusion rates are temperature dependent. The alveolar region also participates in non respiratory functions that contribute to overall health. The lungs filter small blood clots and gas bubbles from the circulation, preventing them from reaching vital organs like the brain. They metabolize certain hormones and other substances, contributing to the body's chemical regulation. They serve as a reservoir for blood that can be rapidly mobilized during emergencies. Understanding alveolar structure and function reveals why certain diseases have such devastating effects on breathing. Emphysema destroys alveolar walls, reducing surface area and impairing gas exchange. Pneumonia fills alveoli with inflammatory fluid, preventing air from reaching the gas exchange surface. Pulmonary fibrosis thickens the respiratory membrane, slowing gas diffusion. Each of these conditions disrupts the delicate architecture that makes efficient gas exchange possible. The transition from the macroarchitecture of the lungs to the microarchitecture of the alveoli represents a journey from the mechanical aspects of breathing to its chemical essence. These microscopic chambers, with their impossibly thin walls and vast collective surface area, transform the simple act of moving air into the complex process of sustaining life. As we prepare to explore how breathing mechanics actually move air into and out of these remarkable structures, we carry with us an appreciation for the elegant simplicity and sophisticated engineering that characterizes the deepest reaches of our respiratory system. Breathing appears effortless, an automatic rhythm so fundamental that we rarely give it conscious thought. Yet beneath this apparent simplicity lies a sophisticated mechanical system that transforms your chest cavity into a remarkably efficient bellows, capable of moving air in and out of your lungs with precision and reliability. The act of inspiration, drawing air into your lungs, represents one of the most elegant examples of biomechanical engineering in the human body, involving the coordinated action of multiple muscle groups, precise pressure gradients, and the clever exploitation of physical laws. At the heart of this mechanical marvel lies the diaphragm, a dome-shaped muscle that forms the floor of your thoracic cavity and serves as the primary engine of breathing. To truly appreciate the diaphragm's role, imagine a flexible dome stretched across the bottom of a cylinder. When this dome contracts and flattens, it increases the volume of the cylinder above it, creating a vacuum that draws air inward. This is precisely what happens during inspiration, though the biological reality is far more sophisticated than this simple mechanical analogy suggests. The diaphragm's anatomy reflects its crucial function. This thin but powerful muscle arises from the lower ribs, the lower end of the sternum, and the upper lumbar vertebrae, with its muscle fibers radiating inward to insert on a central tendon. This arrangement creates a dome shape when the muscle is relaxed, with the peak of the dome reaching up between the fourth and fifth ribs. The diaphragm isn't a simple sheet of muscle, but a complex structure with distinct regions that can be activated independently, allowing for fine control of breathing patterns. When the diaphragm contracts during inspiration, its dome shape flattens and the entire structure descends toward the abdomen. This movement serves multiple functions simultaneously. First, it increases the vertical dimension of the thoracic cavity, creating more space for the lungs to expand. Second, it creates a pressure gradient that drives airflow into the lungs. Third, it applies gentle pressure to the abdominal organs below, contributing to core stability and assisting with circulation. The diaphragm's descent during inspiration is not uniform across its surface. The posterior portions typically descend more than the anterior portions, and the right side often moves slightly more than the left, accommodating the liver's position below the right hemodiaphragm. This asymmetrical movement is perfectly normal and reflects the diaphragm's adaptation to the asymmetrical arrangement of organs within the body. The amount of diaphragmatic movement varies considerably with the depth of breathing. During quiet breathing, the diaphragm typically descends only 1 to 2 centimeters, creating modest changes in thoracic volume that are sufficient for resting ventilation needs. During deep inspiration, however, the diaphragm can descend 4 to 6 centimeters or more, dramatically increasing lung volume and airflow. This adaptability allows the breathing mechanism to adjust precisely to varying metabolic demands. But the diaphragm doesn't work alone. The external intercostal muscles running between adjacent ribs play a crucial supporting role in inspiration. These muscles are oriented diagonally, running downward and forward from each rib to the one below. When they contract, they lift and rotate the ribs upward and outward, expanding the chest cavity in both its anterior, posterior, and lateral dimensions. This rib cage expansion complements the diaphragm's vertical expansion, creating a three-dimensional increase in thoracic volume. The mechanics of rib movement during inspiration involve complex rotational motions around multiple axes. The upper ribs primarily move in a pump handle motion, with their anterior ends rising more than their posterior ends, increasing the anterior posterior diameter of the chest. The lower ribs exhibit more of a bucket handle motion, with their lateral portions moving outward more than their medial portions, increasing the lateral diameter of the chest. These different movement patterns reflect the varying shapes and orientations of individual ribs and their articulations with the spine and sternum. The scalene muscles, located in the neck and connecting the cervical vertebrae to the first two ribs, serve as accessory muscles of inspiration. During quiet breathing, they typically maintain a steady, low-level contraction that stabilizes the upper rib cage and provides a fixed point against which the intercostal muscles can act. During more demanding breathing, the scalenes can contract more forcefully, actively lifting the upper rib cage and further expanding the chest cavity. As the lungs expand, the air pressure within them drops below atmospheric pressure, typically by only a few millimeters of mercury during quiet breathing. This small pressure difference is sufficient to drive airflow through the conducting airways and into the alveoli. The rate of airflow depends on both the magnitude of the pressure gradient and the resistance of the airways to airflow. Boyle's law governs the relationship between lung volume and pressure during breathing. This fundamental principle of physics states that, for a fixed amount of gas at constant temperature, pressure and volume are inversely related. As lung volume increases during inspiration, the pressure of air within the lungs decreases proportionally, creating the driving force for air inflow. This elegant application of basic physics allows the respiratory system to move air without requiring any active pumping mechanism. The pleural pressure, the pressure within the pleural cavity, plays a crucial role in breathing mechanics. Even at rest, pleural pressure is normally slightly negative compared to atmospheric pressure, reflecting the elastic recoil of the lungs pulling inward and the chest wall's tendency to spring outward. During inspiration, pleural pressure becomes even more negative as the chest wall moves outward and stretches the pleural cavity. This increasingly negative pleural pressure is transmitted to the alveolar spaces, creating the pressure gradient that drives inspiration. Flow resistance arises from the friction of air moving through the conducting airways. This resistance depends on airway diameter, the pattern of airflow, laminar versus turbulent, and the physical properties of the air itself. During quiet breathing, flow resistance is minimal, but it can increase significantly during rapid breathing or when airways are narrowed by disease. Tissue resistance comes from the deformation of lung and chest wall tissues during breathing. As these tissues stretch and compress with each breath, they absorb some of the energy applied by the respiratory muscles. Under normal conditions, tissue resistance is small compared to elastic and flow resistance, but it can become significant in diseases that stiffen the lungs or chest wall. The efficiency of inspiration depends on the coordination of all these mechanical elements. The nervous system precisely controls the timing and magnitude of respiratory muscle contractions, adjusting the pattern of breathing to meet changing demands. During exercise, for example, both the depth and rate of breathing increase, requiring more forceful muscle contractions and greater pressure changes to move the larger volumes of air needed. The concept of lung compliance, the ease with which the lungs can be expanded, is central to understanding inspiratory mechanics. Healthy lungs are quite compliant, meaning they expand easily with relatively small pressure changes. Diseases that reduce lung compliance, such as pulmonary fibrosis, make inspiration more difficult and require greater respiratory muscle effort to achieve the same lung expansion. Chest wall compliance is equally important. The rib cage, respiratory muscles, and connecting tissues normally allow for easy expansion during inspiration. Conditions that reduce chest wall compliance, such as severe scoliosis or chest wall injuries, can significantly impair breathing mechanics and increase the work required for inspiration. The three-dimensional nature of chest expansion during inspiration creates complex stress patterns within the lung tissue. Different regions of the lungs experience different degrees of expansion, with the lower lobes typically showing greater volume changes than the upper lobes during quiet breathing. This regional variation in ventilation helps match airflow to blood flow throughout the lungs, optimizing gas exchange efficiency. Surface tension within the alveoli significantly affects inspiratory mechanics. Without surfactant, the surface tension created by the thin layer of fluid lining the alveoli would make lung expansion extremely difficult, requiring enormous inspiratory pressures to overcome the tendency of alveoli to collapse. Surfactant's reduction of surface tension makes normal breathing possible and contributes to lung stability throughout the respiratory cycle. The inspiratory process also involves important feedback mechanisms that help regulate breathing depth and pattern. Stretch receptors within the lungs monitor lung expansion and send signals to the brain that can modify ongoing inspiration. Muscle spindles in the respiratory muscles provide feedback about muscle length and contraction force. Joint receptors in the rib cage monitor chest wall position and movement. Understanding inspiratory mechanics reveals why certain conditions cause breathing difficulties. Respiratory muscle weakness reduces the force available for chest expansion, limiting the pressure gradients that drive airflow. Increased airway resistance makes it harder for air to flow into the lungs despite normal pressure changes. Reduced lung or chest wall compliance increases the work required for inspiration, potentially leading to respiratory fatigue. The mechanical aspects of inspiration also explain why certain breathing techniques can be beneficial. Deep breathing exercises that emphasize diaphragmatic movement can improve respiratory muscle strength and efficiency. Breathing patterns that optimize the coordination between different respiratory muscles can reduce the work of breathing and improve overall respiratory function. As air flows into the lungs through this sophisticated mechanical process, it sets the stage for the equally important process of expiration. The energy stored in the expanded lungs and stretched chest wall during inspiration will soon be released, driving air back out of the respiratory system in a process that, while often passive, involves its own fascinating mechanical principles. If inspiration is the active expansion that draws life sustaining air into your lungs, then expiration is the elegant release that completes the breathing cycle, removing the waste products of cellular metabolism and preparing the respiratory system for the next life giving breath. While inspiration requires the coordinated contraction of multiple muscle groups, normal expiration is largely a passive process that harnesses the elastic energy stored during lung expansion, much like releasing a stretched rubber band and watching it snap back to its original shape. The transition from inspiration to expiration begins with the relaxation of the inspiratory muscles. As the diaphragm ceases its contraction, the dome-shaped muscle begins to rise back toward its resting position, reducing the vertical dimension of the thoracic cavity. The external intercostal muscle relax, allowing the ribs to settle downward and inward from their expanded position. This muscle relaxation doesn't immediately stop lung expansion for a brief moment at the end of inspiration. Airflow ceases as pressures equilibrate, marking the pause between breathing in and breathing out. The driving force for passive expiration comes from the elastic recoil of both the lungs and the chest wall. During inspiration, these structures were stretched like springs, being compressed or extended, storing potential energy in their elastic fibers and tissues. As the inspiratory muscles relax, this stored energy is released, providing the force needed to drive air out of the lungs without requiring any additional muscular effort. Lung elastic recoil arises from two primary sources: the elastic fibers woven throughout the lung tissue and the surface tension within the alveoli. The lung's elastic fibers, composed mainly of elastin and collagen, form a three-dimensional network that extends from the pleural surface deep into the lung parenchyma. These fibers are stretched during inspiration and naturally contract during expiration, much like elastic bands returning to their resting length. The elastic fiber network in the lungs demonstrates remarkable engineering efficiency. The fibers are arranged in patterns that distribute stress evenly throughout the lung tissue during expansion, preventing excessive strain on any single region. They connect alveolar walls to each other and to the larger airways, creating an integrated system where the elastic recoil of individual alveoli combines to generate the overall recoil force of the entire lung. Surface tension within the alveoli contributes significantly to expiratory force through a mechanism that beautifully illustrates the physics of curved surfaces. The law of Laplace states that the pressure inside a sphere is directly related to the surface tension of the liquid lamellate and inversely related to the sphere's radius. In alveoli, the thin film of surfactant-containing fluid creates surface tension that tends to collapse these tiny air sacs, generating pressure that helps drive air outward during expiration. Surfactant's role in expiration is as crucial as its function during inspiration, though for different reasons. As alveoli decrease in size during expiration, surfactant concentration increases on the alveolar surface, further reducing surface tension and preventing alveolar collapse. This dynamic adjustment ensures that expiration proceeds smoothly without the smaller alveoli collapsing completely, which would require enormous inspiratory pressures to reopen them. The chest wall also contributes to expiratory force through its own elastic properties. During inspiration, the rib cage is expanded beyond its natural resting position, storing elastic energy in the ribs, intercostal muscles, and connecting tissues. The sternum is pushed outward, the ribs are rotated upward, and the intercostal spaces are stretched. All of these deformations create restoring forces that drive the chest wall back toward its resting configuration during expiration. Pleural pressure changes during expiration mirror those of inspiration, but in reverse. As the chest wall recoils inward and the lungs contract, pleural pressure becomes less negative, eventually approaching atmospheric pressure during quiet expiration. This pressure change is transmitted to the alveolar spaces, compressing the air within them and creating the pressure gradient that drives expiratory airflow. Passive expiration is sufficient for quiet breathing at rest, but active expiration becomes necessary during exercise, speech, coughing, or when respiratory demand increases. Active expiration involves the contraction of muscles that further compress the chest cavity and increase the driving pressure for airflow. The primary muscles of active expiration are the internal intercostal muscles and the muscles of the abdominal wall. The internal intercostal muscles run perpendicular to the external intercostals, oriented upward and backward from each rib to the one above. When these muscles contract, they pull the ribs downward and inward, actively compressing the chest cavity beyond what passive recoil alone would achieve. This active compression increases pleural pressure and generates higher expiratory flow rates than passive mechanisms alone. The abdominal muscles, including the rectus abdominis, external and internal obliques, and transversus abdominis, play a crucial role in active expiration by compressing the abdominal contents and forcing the diaphragm upward. This abdominal compression reduces the volume of the thoracic cavity from below, while the internal intercostals compress it from the sides, creating a powerful expiratory force that can generate high airflow rates and large volume changes. During vigorous exercise, active expiration becomes essential for maintaining adequate ventilation. The metabolic demands of exercise require both increased oxygen intake and increased carbon dioxide removal, necessitating larger tidal volumes and higher respiratory rates. Active expiration allows for the complete emptying of the lungs and rapid preparation for the next inspiratory cycle. The coordination between passive and active expiratory mechanisms demonstrates the respiratory system's remarkable adaptability. During quiet breathing, passive recoil provides adequate expiratory force with minimal energy expenditure. As ventilatory demands increase, active expiratory muscles are progressively recruited, providing additional force while maintaining efficient breathing patterns. Coughing represents a specialized form of active expiration that serves protective functions. The cough reflex begins with a deep inspiration, followed by closure of the glottis, the opening between the vocal cords, while expiratory muscles contract forcefully. When the glottis suddenly opens, the high-pressure air rushes out at tremendous velocity, carrying with it any foreign particles or excessive secretions that may be present in the airways. The mechanics of coughing illustrate the impressive pressures that active expiration can generate. During the compression phase of a cough, pressures within the chest can reach levels many times higher than those occurring during normal breathing. These high pressures are necessary to achieve the rapid air velocities needed for effective clearance of the airways. Sneezing employs similar mechanical principles but involves primarily the upper respiratory tract. Like coughing, sneezing involves a preliminary inspiration, compression of air with glottal closure, and sudden release of high velocity airflow. The sneeze reflex helps clear irritants from the nasal cavity and upper airways, protecting the more delicate structures deeper in the respiratory system. Expiratory reserve volume represents the additional air that can be expelled from the lungs beyond the normal tidal volume through active expiration. This reserve capacity provides an important safety margin, allowing for increased ventilation when metabolic demands rise or when respiratory efficiency is compromised by disease. The expiratory reserve volume typically amounts to about 1,100 to 1,200 milliliters in healthy adults. The relationship between lung volume and expiratory flow reveals important information about respiratory mechanics. At high lung volumes, elastic recoil forces are greatest and expiratory flow rates are highest. As lung volume decreases during expiration, recoil forces diminish and flow rates decline. This volume-dependent relationship helps explain why diseases that reduce lung elastic recoil, such as emphysema, cause characteristic changes in expiratory flow patterns. Airway dynamics during expiration differ significantly from those during inspiration. During inspiration, the negative pressure within the airways tends to dilate them, reducing resistance to airflow. During expiration, especially active expiration, the positive pressure within the airways can cause them to narrow or even collapse, increasing resistance and limiting flow rates. This dynamic compression of airways becomes particularly important during forced expiration and contributes to the effort-independent portion of the expiratory flow volume curve. The equal pressure point concept helps explain why there are limits to how much expiratory flow can be increased by greater expiratory effort. At some point during forced expiration, the pressure surrounding the airways equals the pressure within them, creating a choke point that limits further increases in flow rate, regardless of how much additional expiratory pressure is applied. Temperature and humidity changes occur during expiration as the warm, humidified air from the lungs moves back through the conducting airways. The nasal cavity and upper airways recover some of the heat and moisture that were added to the inspired air, improving the efficiency of the air conditioning process. This heat and moisture recovery becomes particularly important in cold or dry environments. The neural control of expiration involves both automatic and voluntary mechanisms. The respiratory control centers in the brainstem coordinate the timing of expiratory muscle relaxation and activation, adjusting expiratory patterns to match metabolic demands and maintain appropriate blood gas levels. Voluntary control allows for conscious modification of expiratory patterns during activities such as speech, singing, or breath holding. Understanding expiration mechanics helps explain why certain respiratory conditions cause characteristic symptoms. Diseases that reduce lung elastic recoil make passive expiration less effective, requiring increased use of active expiratory muscles and leading to a sensation of breathlessness. Conditions that narrow the airways increase expiratory resistance, prolonging expiration and potentially trapping air within. The lungs. The elegant efficiency of normal expiration, whether passive or active, completes the mechanical cycle of breathing. Air that entered the lungs, rich in oxygen and low in carbon dioxide, exits depleted of oxygen and enriched with the waste products of cellular metabolism. This cyclic exchange, repeated roughly 20,000 times each day, requires no conscious effort, yet sustains every aspect of life. As we prepare to explore how the nervous system coordinates this vital process, we carry with us an appreciation for the sophisticated mechanical principles that make each breath possible. Deep within your brainstem, in regions so ancient and fundamental that they began their work before you took your first breath and will continue until your last, lies the neural machinery that controls breathing. This respiratory control system operates with such reliability that you can sleep, think, exercise, and live your entire life without ever consciously directing a single breath, yet it possesses the sophistication to adjust breathing patterns instantly in response to changing demands, emotions, or environmental conditions. The primary respiratory control center resides in the medulla oblongata, the most primitive part of your brainstem that connects directly to the spinal cord. Here, clusters of neurons form intricate networks that generate the basic breathing rhythm with the same automatic reliability as a pacemaker generates heartbeats. Unlike the heart's single pacemaker, however, the respiratory control system involves multiple interconnected neural circuits that work together to produce the complex patterns of muscle activation required for breathing. The pre-Botzinger complex neurons don't all fire simultaneously, but rather in coordinated waves that create the breathing pattern. During inspiration, these neurons burst into activity, sending excitatory signals to motor neurons that control the diaphragm and other inspiratory muscles. As the burst subsides, inspiratory muscle activity decreases and passive expiration begins. The duration and intensity of these bursts determine the depth and rate of breathing, allowing for fine adjustment of ventilation to meet metabolic demands. Surrounding the pre-Butzinger complex are additional groups of respiratory neurons that modify and refine the basic breathing rhythm. The Butzinger complex, located nearby in the medulla, contains neurons that are active primarily during expiration. These neurons help coordinate the transition from inspiration to expiration and become particularly important during active expiration when the internal, intercostal, and abdominal muscles must be activated. The ventral respiratory group, a column of neurons extending through much of the medulla, contains the motor neurons that directly control respiratory muscles. These neurons receive input from the rhythm-generating circuits and translate rhythmic signals into precisely timed muscle contractions. Different populations within the ventral respiratory group control different muscle groups. Some innervate the diaphragm, others control intercostal muscles, and still others regulate accessory respiratory muscles. The dorsal respiratory group, located in the region of the nucleus tractus solitarius, serves primarily as a relay station for sensory information related to breathing. Neurons in this region receive input from chemoreceptors that monitor blood gases, mechanoreceptors that sense lung inflation, and other sensors throughout the body. They process this sensory information and relay it to the rhythm-generating circuits, allowing breathing patterns to be adjusted based on physiological feedback. The pontine respiratory centers, located in the brainstem region above the medulla, provide additional layers of control over breathing patterns. The pneumotaxic center, situated in the upper pons, appears to fine-tune the breathing rhythm by influencing the duration of inspiration. Stimulation of this center tends to shorten inspiration and increase breathing rate, while damage to this region can lead to prolonged, gasping breaths. The apneustic center, located in the lower pons, has the opposite effect, tending to promote sustained inspiration. Under normal circumstances, the apneustic center's activity is modulated by input from the pneumotaxic center and other brain regions, But when these modulating influences are removed, breathing can become characterized by prolonged inspiratory efforts, followed by brief expiratory pauses. These brainstem control centers operate largely below the level of consciousness, maintaining breathing during sleep, anesthesia, and even coma states. The automaticity of breathing control represents a crucial evolutionary adaptation. If breathing required constant conscious attention, sleep would be impossible, and any distraction or loss of consciousness could prove fatal. However, the automatic control system is not rigidly fixed, but rather highly adaptable. The neural circuits that generate breathing rhythm can be modified by numerous factors, allowing breathing patterns to change in response to varying physiological demands. During exercise, for example, signals from the motor cortex and feedback from working muscles can increase both the rate and depth of breathing before any significant changes in blood gases occur. Emotional states can profoundly influence breathing patterns through connections between the limbic system and respiratory control centers. Anxiety typically increases breathing rate and can lead to hyperventilation, while relaxation tends to slow and deepen breathing. Fear can cause sudden changes in breathing pattern, including breath holding or gasping. These emotional influences on breathing demonstrate the intimate connection between psychological states and respiratory function. The respiratory control system also includes important protective reflexes that can override the normal breathing pattern when necessary. The cough reflex, triggered by irritation of airways, involves a complex sequence of muscle contractions coordinated by specialized neural circuits in the medulla. The sneeze reflex, initiated by nasal irritation, follows a similar pattern but involves different muscle groups and timing. Voluntary control of breathing involves higher brain centers, particularly the cerebral cortex. Motor areas of the cortex can send signals directly to respiratory motor neurons, bypassing the automatic control system and allowing conscious modification of breathing patterns. This voluntary control enables activities such as speech, singing, breath holding, and various breathing exercises. The ability to voluntarily control breathing is limited, however, by powerful automatic mechanisms that prioritize physiological needs over conscious desires. You can hold your breath voluntarily, but as carbon dioxide levels rise and oxygen levels fall, automatic drive mechanisms eventually override conscious control and force resumption of breathing. This override system ensures that voluntary breath control cannot compromise survival. Speech represents one of the most sophisticated examples of voluntary respiratory control. Speaking requires precise coordination of breathing with vocal cord positioning and oral movements. The respiratory control system must adjust breathing patterns to provide adequate airflow for vocalization while maintaining sufficient gas exchange for metabolic needs. Singers and wind instrument players develop particularly refined voluntary control over their respiratory muscles. The neural control of breathing also involves important feedback mechanisms that help maintain respiratory homeostasis. Stretch receptors in the lungs, known as pulmonary stretch receptors, send signals to the brainstem that help regulate the depth of breathing. When the lungs become overly inflated, these receptors send inhibitory signals that terminate inspiration and promote expiration, preventing overexpansion of the lungs. Irritant receptors scattered throughout the airways can trigger protective responses when stimulated by noxious substances or excessive secretions. These receptors can initiate coughing, breath holding, or changes in breathing pattern designed to minimize exposure to harmful substances. J receptors, located near pulmonary capillaries, respond to pulmonary edema, inflammation, or other pathological conditions by triggering rapid, shallow breathing patterns. The integration of all these neural control mechanisms creates a respiratory control system of remarkable sophistication and reliability. The automatic circuits ensure that breathing continues without conscious effort, while modulatory systems allow for appropriate adjustments based on physiological needs, emotional states, and voluntary desires. Protective reflexes provide emergency responses to threats, while feedback mechanisms help maintain optimal respiratory function. Understanding neural control of breathing helps explain why certain neurological conditions affect respiratory function. Damage to the medulla can severely impair or eliminate automatic breathing, requiring mechanical ventilation for survival. Spinal cord injuries that interrupt the pathways between brainstem control centers and respiratory muscles can cause respiratory paralysis. Diseases that affect neuromuscular transmission can weaken respiratory muscles despite normal neural control. The remarkable reliability of respiratory neural control also explains why breathing disorders often indicate serious underlying problems. Sleep apnea, for example, represents a failure of normal respiratory control mechanisms during sleep. Central sleep apnea involves dysfunction of the brainstem control centers, while obstructive sleep apnea results from failure of upper airway muscles to maintain adequate tone. As we transition from understanding how the brain controls breathing to exploring the chemical signals that guide these control systems, we begin to appreciate that respiratory regulation involves not just neural circuits, but also sophisticated chemical sensing mechanisms that monitor the body's need for gas exchange moment by moment. While the neural circuits in your brainstem provide the basic machinery for generating breathing rhythms, they don't operate in isolation. Instead, they respond continuously to a sophisticated array of chemical signals that monitor your body's respiratory needs with extraordinary precision. These chemical messengers, primarily carbon dioxide, oxygen, and hydrogen ions that determine pH, serve as the feedback system that adjusts breathing to match your metabolic demands, ensuring that each breath delivers exactly what your body needs while removing precisely what it must eliminate. The most important of these chemical signals, perhaps surprisingly, is not oxygen, but carbon dioxide. While oxygen is essential for life, carbon dioxide serves as the primary driver of breathing under normal circumstances. This seeming paradox reflects the remarkable sensitivity of the body's pH regulation system and the critical importance of maintaining acid-base balance for optimal cellular function. Carbon dioxide's role as the primary respiratory stimulus stems from its relationship to pH regulation. When carbon dioxide dissolves in blood, it forms carbonic acid through a reaction catalyzed by the enzyme carbonic anhydrase. This carbonic acid quickly dissociates into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions, with the hydrogen ions directly affecting blood pH. As carbon dioxide levels rise, pH falls, becomes more acidic, and as carbon dioxide levels fall, pH rises, becomes more alkaline. The body's cells continuously produce carbon dioxide as a waste product of cellular respiration. During periods of increased metabolic activity, such as exercise, carbon dioxide production increases dramatically. If breathing didn't adjust to match this increased production, carbon dioxide would accumulate in the blood, driving pH to dangerously acidic levels that could disrupt enzyme function and cellular processes throughout the body. Central chemoreceptors, located near the ventral surface of the medulla oblongata, serve as the primary sensors for carbon dioxide and pH changes. These specialized neurons are bathed in cerebrospinal fluid, which provides a relatively isolated environment for detecting changes in carbon dioxide levels. When carbon dioxide in the blood increases, it crosses the blood-brain barrier and enters the cerebrospinal fluid, where it forms carbonic acid and releases hydrogen ions. The central chemoreceptors are exquisitely sensitive to these pH changes in cerebrospinal fluid. Even tiny increases in hydrogen ion concentration trigger increased activity in these neurons, which send excitatory signals to the respiratory control centers. This stimulation increases both the rate and depth of breathing, enhancing carbon dioxide elimination and helping restore normal pH levels. The sensitivity of this system is remarkable. Under normal conditions, an increase in carbon dioxide levels of just 2 to 3 mmHg is sufficient to double the ventilation rate. This extraordinary responsiveness ensures that acid-base balance is maintained within very narrow limits despite wide variations in metabolic activity and carbon dioxide production. Peripheral chemoreceptors, located in small structures called carotid and aortic bodies, provide additional chemical sensing capabilities. The carotid bodies, situated at the bifurcation of the common carotid arteries in the neck, are the primary peripheral chemoreceptors in humans. These tiny organs, each weighing only about 2 milligrams, receive an enormous blood supply relative to their size. Their blood flow per gram of tissue is among the highest in the body. The peripheral chemoreceptors respond primarily to decreases in blood oxygen levels, though they also contribute to carbon dioxide and pH sensing. Under normal circumstances, when oxygen levels are adequate, these receptors have minimal activity. However, when oxygen levels fall below a certain threshold, typically when arterial oxygen pressure drops below about 60 mmHg, they become intensely active, sending powerful stimulatory signals to the respiratory control centers. This oxygen sensing system serves as a crucial backup mechanism that becomes critically important when oxygen availability is compromised. At high altitudes, where atmospheric oxygen pressure is reduced, peripheral chemoreceptors drive the increase in breathing that helps compensate for the reduced oxygen availability. During severe lung disease, when oxygen transfer is impaired, these receptors help maintain adequate ventilation despite the respiratory system's reduced efficiency. The peripheral chemoreceptors also respond to carbon dioxide, but their contribution to CO2 sensing is normally overshadowed by the much more sensitive central chemoreceptors. However, in certain disease states, or when central chemoreceptor function is impaired, peripheral chemoreceptors can provide important backup CO2 sensing capability. The cellular mechanisms underlying chemoreceptor function involve sophisticated molecular machinery that can detect tiny changes in chemical concentrations. In peripheral chemoreceptors, specialized cells called glomus cells contain oxygen-sensitive potassium channels that close when oxygen levels fall. This closure depolarizes the cells and triggers the release of neurotransmitters that stimulate afferent nerve fibers, leading to the brainstem. Carbon dioxide sensing involves different mechanisms in central and peripheral chemoreceptors. Central chemoreceptors appear to detect pH changes directly through acid-sensitive ion channels, while peripheral chemoreceptors may use both direct CO2 sensing and pH sensitive mechanisms. The exact molecular details of these processes continue to be areas of active research. The integration of signals from central and peripheral chemoreceptors occurs in the respiratory control centers of the brainstem, where multiple inputs are processed to determine the appropriate respiratory response. Under normal conditions, central chemoreceptors provide the dominant drive to breathing, with peripheral chemoreceptors contributing relatively little. However, during hypoxia, or when central chemoreceptor function is compromised, peripheral chemoreceptors can become the primary drivers of respiratory activity. The time course of chemoreceptor responses differs between central and peripheral receptors. Peripheral chemoreceptors respond very rapidly to changes in blood gases, with response times measured in seconds. Central chemoreceptors respond more slowly, partly because carbon dioxide must cross the blood-brain barrier to reach the cerebrospinal fluid, where these receptors are located. This difference in response times allows for both rapid adjustments to acute changes and sustained responses to longer-term alterations in gas exchange. The relationship between carbon dioxide, oxygen, and pH creates complex interactions in respiratory control. For example, when oxygen levels are low, the resulting increase in breathing not only improves oxygen uptake, but also increases carbon dioxide elimination. If this hyperventilation continues, it can drive carbon dioxide levels so low that pH becomes alkaline, potentially reducing the drive to breathe and creating competing influences on respiratory control. These interactions become particularly important in disease states. Patients with chronic lung disease often develop chronically elevated carbon dioxide levels, which can blunt the sensitivity of central chemoreceptors through adaptive mechanisms. In such patients, peripheral chemoreceptors responding to low oxygen may become the primary drivers of breathing, a situation that can have important clinical implications. The buffering systems in blood and tissues also interact with respiratory control mechanisms. The bicarbonate buffer system, the most important buffering system in blood, helps minimize pH changes when carbon dioxide levels fluctuate. However, this buffering capacity is limited, and sustained changes in carbon dioxide production or elimination require respiratory adjustments to maintain pH balance. The kidney also plays an important role in acid-base regulation, but its responses are much slower than respiratory adjustments. While the kidneys can adjust bicarbonate retention and hydrogen ion excretion to help maintain pH balance, these changes occur over hours to days rather than the seconds to minutes required for respiratory adjustments. This difference in timescales makes respiratory control the primary mechanism for rapid acid-base regulation. Exercise provides an excellent example of how chemical feedback systems adjust breathing to match metabolic demands. As muscle activity increases, carbon dioxide production rises dramatically. The resulting increase in blood carbon dioxide levels and decrease in pH triggers increased ventilation that helps maintain normal blood gas levels despite the increased metabolic demands. The precision of this system is such that trained athletes can sustain high levels of exercise for extended periods while maintaining blood pH within normal limits. Temperature also affects chemoreceptor function and respiratory control. Fever increases the metabolic rate and carbon dioxide production, leading to increased ventilation. Hypothermia has the opposite effect, reducing metabolic rate and ventilatory drive. These temperature effects help explain why breathing patterns change during illness or exposure to extreme temperatures. The development of chemoreceptor function begins before birth and continues to mature during infancy and childhood. Fetal chemoreceptors are relatively insensitive to hypoxia, which is appropriate for the low oxygen environment of the womb. After birth, chemoreceptor sensitivity increases rapidly, helping newborns adjust to air breathing. However, full maturation of chemoreceptor responses may not occur until several months after birth, which may contribute to the vulnerability of young infants to respiratory problems. Understanding chemical control of breathing helps explain why certain conditions cause characteristic changes in breathing patterns. Diabetic ketoacidosis, for example, produces deep, rapid breathing, Kussmaul breathing, as the respiratory system attempts to compensate for metabolic acidosis by eliminating excess carbon dioxide. High altitude exposure initially causes hyperventilation as peripheral chemoreceptors respond to reduced oxygen levels, though this response is gradually modified by acclimatization processes. The sophisticated chemical feedback systems that control breathing demonstrate the body's remarkable ability to maintain homeostasis in the face of constantly changing demands. These systems operate with precision that rivals the best engineered control systems, adjusting breathing continuously to maintain optimal internal conditions while remaining largely invisible to conscious awareness. As we explore how these chemical signals guide respiratory responses to various challenges and environmental conditions, we gain deeper appreciation for the elegant integration of chemistry and physiology that makes each breath possible. The human respiratory system's true elegance becomes apparent not in the quiet moments of rest, but in its remarkable ability to adapt to challenges, demands, and changing conditions. From the intense metabolic demands of athletic performance to the thin air of mountain peaks, from the polluted atmosphere of urban environments to the physiological changes of aging, your respiratory system demonstrates an extraordinary capacity for adaptation that ensures survival and function across an enormous range of conditions. Exercise represents perhaps the most dramatic example of respiratory adaptation in daily life. When you begin physical activity, your breathing changes almost immediately, often before any significant alterations in blood gases have occurred. This anticipatory response, triggered by signals from the motor cortex and feedback from working muscles, illustrates the sophisticated integration between the respiratory system and other physiological systems. As exercise intensity increases, oxygen consumption can rise 20-fold or more above resting levels, while carbon dioxide production increases proportionally. The respiratory system must match this increased gas exchange demand through coordinated adjustments in breathing rate, tidal volume, and the distribution of ventilation within the lungs. During moderate exercise, these adjustments maintain blood gas levels remarkably close to resting values, demonstrating the system's impressive regulatory capacity. The pattern of respiratory adjustment during exercise follows a predictable sequence. Initially, breathing rate increases more than tidal volume, providing rapid adjustment with minimal additional work. As exercise intensity continues to rise, tidal volume increases progressively until it reaches about 50–60% of vital capacity, beyond which further increases in ventilation come primarily from continued increases in breathing rate. This pattern optimizes the efficiency of breathing while minimizing the work required from respiratory muscles. Trained athletes demonstrate remarkable respiratory adaptations that enhance their exercise capacity. Their respiratory muscles develop greater strength and endurance, allowing them to sustain high ventilation rates for extended periods. Their breathing becomes more efficient, extracting more oxygen from each breath and eliminating carbon dioxide more effectively. They also develop enhanced ability to maintain normal blood gas levels despite intense metabolic demands. The respiratory system's response to altitude represents another fascinating example of adaptation under pressure. As altitude increases, atmospheric pressure decreases, reducing the driving pressure for oxygen diffusion from alveoli into blood. At 10,000 feet, atmospheric pressure is only about 70% of sea level pressure, while at the summit of Mount Everest, it's only about 33% of sea level pressure. The immediate response to altitude exposure involves hyperventilation driven by peripheral chemoreceptors detecting reduced oxygen levels. This hyperventilation increases oxygen uptake, but also eliminates excess carbon dioxide, potentially leading to respiratory alkalosis. The resulting pH changes can cause symptoms such as dizziness, tingling, and altered mental function components of acute mountain sickness. Over days to weeks at altitude, the body undergoes acclimatization processes that improve oxygen delivery. Despite reduced atmospheric pressure, the kidneys begin retaining bicarbonate to compensate for the respiratory alkalosis, allowing ventilation to increase further without dangerous pH changes. Red blood cell production increases, enhancing the blood's oxygen carrying capacity. Capillary density in tissues may increase, improving oxygen delivery to cells. These acclimatization processes demonstrate the respiratory system's integration with other physiological systems. The respiratory adjustments to altitude trigger compensatory changes in kidney function, cardiovascular responses, and cellular metabolism. The result is a coordinated adaptation that allows humans to function at altitudes that would be rapidly fatal without these adjustments. Pollution and environmental toxins present different challenges to the respiratory system, requiring protective rather than adaptive responses. The lungs' defense mechanisms become critically important when faced with particulate matter, toxic gases, or other airborne contaminants. The mucociliary escalator works overtime to remove particles, while protective reflexes, such as cough and sneeze, attempt to expel irritants before they reach sensitive gas exchange regions. Urban air pollution creates chronic challenges for respiratory function. Fine particulate matter can penetrate deep into the lungs, triggering inflammatory responses that may impair gas exchange efficiency over time. Gaseous pollutants such as ozone and nitrogen dioxide can irritate airways and alter lung function. The respiratory system's response to these chronic exposures involves both protective mechanisms and potentially harmful inflammatory responses. Individual variation in pollution response reflects differences in lung defense mechanisms, genetic factors, and overall health status. Some people develop increased sensitivity to air pollutants, experiencing symptoms such as cough, wheeze, or shortness of breath, even with relatively low exposures. Others seem remarkably resistant to pollution effects, maintaining normal respiratory function despite significant environmental challenges. Age-related changes in respiratory function illustrate the system's gradual adaptation to the aging process. Beginning around age 25, lung function typically declines slowly but progressively throughout life. The chest wall becomes stiffer, reducing compliance and making breathing slightly more work-intensive. The lungs themselves lose some elastic recoil, making expiration less efficient and potentially leading to air trapping. Respiratory muscle strength typically declines with age, though this process can be slowed significantly through regular physical activity. The respiratory control system may become less sensitive to chemical stimuli, potentially affecting the precision of breathing regulation. Despite these changes, the respiratory system usually maintains adequate function for normal activities throughout life, demonstrating remarkable functional reserve. Pregnancy creates unique respiratory challenges that showcase the system's adaptability. As the growing fetus increases oxygen demands and the enlarging uterus restricts diaphragmatic movement, the respiratory system must adjust to maintain adequate gas exchange for both mother and child. Tidal volume increases significantly during pregnancy, while breathing rate remains relatively unchanged, resulting in increased minute ventilation that helps meet the increased metabolic demands. The hormonal changes of pregnancy also affect respiratory function. Progesterone increases respiratory drive, contributing to the sensation of breathlessness that many pregnant women experience. These hormonal effects begin early in pregnancy before significant mechanical changes occur, illustrating the complex integration between endocrine and respiratory systems. Disease states reveal both the respiratory system's vulnerability and its remarkable compensatory abilities. Chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD, gradually reduces the efficiency of gas exchange, but patients often maintain reasonable function for years through respiratory adaptations. Breathing patterns may change to optimize ventilation, perfusion matching. Respiratory muscles may strengthen to overcome increased airway resistance, and breathing strategies may be unconsciously modified to minimize the work of breathing. Asthma demonstrates the respiratory system's ability to respond rapidly to perceived threats. During an asthma attack, airways constrict and inflammation increases, dramatically reducing airflow. The respiratory system responds with increased breathing effort and altered breathing patterns designed to maintain adequate ventilation despite the increased airway resistance. While these responses can be life-saving in the short term, they can also contribute to respiratory muscle fatigue if the attack is prolonged. Sleep presents unique challenges for respiratory control that illustrate the system's need for continuous adaptation. During sleep, respiratory control becomes more dependent on automatic mechanisms as voluntary influences diminish. Sleep stages affect breathing patterns, with REM sleep showing particularly variable respiratory patterns that reflect the complex interplay between sleep-related brain activity and respiratory control. Sleep apnea represents a failure of normal respiratory adaptations during sleep. In obstructive sleep apnea, upper airway muscles fail to maintain adequate tone, leading to airway collapse and interruption of breathing. In central sleep apnea, the brainstem control mechanisms become unstable, leading to periodic cessation of breathing efforts. Both conditions demonstrate the critical importance of continuous respiratory adaptation for survival. Temperature extremes require respiratory adaptations that help maintain both gas exchange and thermal balance. Cold air can trigger airway constriction and increase the work of breathing, while also requiring additional heating and humidification by the upper airways. Heat exposure increases breathing rate and may alter breathing patterns to enhance heat loss through increased ventilation. High-intensity athletic performance pushes respiratory adaptation to its limits. Elite endurance athletes may achieve minute ventilation rates of 150 to 200 liters per minute or more, compared to resting rates of 6 to 8 liters per minute. These extreme ventilation rates require extraordinary coordination of respiratory muscles and precise regulation of breathing patterns to maintain efficiency while avoiding respiratory muscle fatigue. The respiratory system's adaptability extends to unusual environments and conditions. Underwater diving requires breath holding abilities that push the limits of respiratory physiology, while high altitude mountaineering combines extreme physical demands with reduced oxygen availability. Professional wind instrument players develop specialized respiratory control abilities that allow for extended phrases and precise air pressure control. Understanding respiratory adaptation helps explain why physical fitness has such profound effects on overall health and why respiratory diseases can be so debilitating. The respiratory system's ability to adapt to challenges provides an important safety margin that can be enhanced through appropriate training and lifestyle choices, or compromised by disease, aging, or environmental factors. As we transition to exploring the intimate relationship between respiratory and cardiovascular systems, we carry with us an appreciation for the respiratory system's remarkable adaptability. This adaptability ensures not only survival under challenging conditions, but also the optimization of function across the wide range of demands that characterize human life. The respiratory system's ability to adapt provides the foundation for understanding how breathing integrates with circulation to deliver oxygen and remove carbon dioxide from every cell in the body. In the grand symphony of human physiology, few partnerships are as intimate and essential as the relationship between the respiratory and circulatory systems. These two systems function as integrated halves of a single gas transport mechanism, with the lungs serving as the interface between the external atmosphere and the internal circulation, while the cardiovascular system serves as the delivery network that carries gases between the lungs and the body's tissues. Understanding this partnership reveals how the simple act of breathing connects to every cell in your body through an elegant network of coordination and cooperation. The anatomical relationship between respiratory and circulatory systems begins in the lungs themselves, where pulmonary circulation creates an intimate association between air spaces and blood vessels. Unlike the systemic circulation that must traverse long distances to reach distant organs, pulmonary circulation operates over microscopic distances, with blood and air separated by the gossamer-thin respiratory membrane we explored earlier. Pulmonary circulation differs fundamentally from systemic circulation in both structure and function. While systemic arteries carry high-pressure, oxygenated blood away from the left heart, pulmonary arteries carry low-pressure, deoxygenated blood away from the right heart. This reversal of the typical artery-vein oxygen relationship reflects the lung's unique role as the site where blood gains oxygen rather than delivers it. The pulmonary circulatory system operates as a low-pressure, high-volume network perfectly adapted for gas exchange. Pulmonary arterial pressures are only about 1/6 of systemic arterial pressures, reducing the workload on the right heart while maintaining adequate blood flow through the lungs. This low-pressure system also minimizes the risk of fluid leakage into the NCAS alveoli, which would severely impair gas exchange. The branching pattern of pulmonary blood vessels mirrors the branching of the airways, creating parallel networks that optimize the matching of ventilation and blood flow. Pulmonary arteries divide alongside bronchi, ensuring that each lung region receives blood flow proportional to its ventilation. This parallel arrangement allows for local adjustments in blood flow to match regional differences in ventilation, maximizing overall gas exchange efficiency. Pulmonary capillaries form dense networks surrounding each alveolus, creating an enormous surface area for gas exchange. These capillaries are so numerous and closely spaced that they form an almost continuous sheet of blood around each air sac. The transit time for blood through these capillaries, typically about 0.75 seconds at rest, provides sufficient time for complete equilibration of oxygen and carbon dioxide between blood and alveolar air. The concept of ventilation perfusion matching represents one of the most sophisticated aspects of respiratory circulatory coordination. For optimal gas exchange efficiency, the ratio of ventilation, airflow, to perfusion, blood flow, should be approximately equal in all lung regions. The body achieves this matching through local control mechanisms that adjust both airflow and blood flow based on regional conditions. When ventilation exceeds perfusion in a lung region, high V divided by Q ratio, that region contributes inefficiently to gas exchange because excess ventilation is wasted on blood flow that cannot carry away the exchanged gases. Conversely, when perfusion exceeds ventilation, low V divided by Q ratio, blood passes through the lungs without adequate gas exchange, essentially creating a shunt that reduces overall oxygenation efficiency. The body possesses elegant mechanisms for optimizing ventilation perfusion matching. Hypoxic pulmonary vasoconstriction redirects blood flow away from poorly ventilated lung regions by constricting pulmonary vessels in areas where alveolar oxygen levels are low. This response, unique to pulmonary circulation, ensures that blood flow is directed preferentially to well-ventilated regions where gas exchange can occur efficiently. Local control of airway caliber provides the complementary mechanism for ventilation perfusion matching. Dilating when CO2 is high, indicating good blood flow that needs more ventilation, and constricting when CO2 is low, indicating poor blood flow where ventilation would be wasted. The integration of breathing mechanics with cardiovascular function creates important interactions between respiratory and circulatory systems. During inspiration, the negative pressure within the thoracic cavity not only expands the lungs, but also assists venous return to the heart by creating a pressure gradient that draws blood toward the chest. This respiratory pump effect can significantly enhance cardiac output, particularly during deep breathing or exercise. Conversely, inspiration increases the afterload on the left ventricle by increasing the pressure difference the heart must overcome to eject blood into the systemic circulation. These opposite effects on right and left heart function create the normal respiratory variations in heart rate and blood pressure known as respiratory sinus arrhythmia, where heart rate increases slightly during inspiration and decreases during expiration. The Frank-Starling mechanism ensures that these respiratory effects on venous return are accommodated without disrupting cardiovascular function. As inspiration increases venous return to the right heart, the increased ventricular filling automatically increases stroke volume, maintaining cardiac output despite the changing venous return. This mechanism allows the respiratory and cardiovascular systems to function harmoniously despite their mechanical interactions. Exercise reveals the remarkable coordination between respiratory and cardiovascular adaptations. As oxygen demand increases during physical activity, both systems respond in concert to meet the challenge. Breathing rate and depth increase to enhance oxygen uptake and carbon dioxide elimination, while heart rate and stroke volume increase to enhance oxygen delivery to working muscles. The cardiovascular system's response to exercise includes redistribution of blood flow that optimizes oxygen delivery. Blood flow to working muscles increases dramatically through local vasodilation, while flow to non essential organs decreases through sympathetic vasoconstriction. This redistribution ensures that the oxygen extracted by the lungs is delivered preferentially to the tissues that need it most. The relationship between oxygen carrying capacity and respiratory function illustrates another aspect of respiratory cardiovascular coordination. Hemoglobin concentration in blood determines how much oxygen can be carried per unit of blood volume, directly affecting the efficiency of oxygen transport. Conditions that reduce hemoglobin levels, anemia, require compensatory increases in both cardiac output and ventilation to maintain adequate oxygen delivery. At high altitudes, the reduced oxygen availability triggers coordinated responses in both systems. Initial hyperventilation increases oxygen uptake, while increased heart rate enhances oxygen delivery. Over time, increased red blood cell production, polycythemia, enhances oxygen carrying capacity, allowing cardiac output to return toward normal levels while maintaining improved oxygen delivery. The respiratory cardiovascular partnership also extends to carbon dioxide transport and pH regulation. The cardiovascular system carries carbon dioxide from tissues to the lungs in three forms: dissolved in plasma, bound to hemoglobin, and as bicarbonate ions. This multimodal transport system provides both efficiency and flexibility in carbon dioxide elimination. The Haldane effect describes the interaction between oxygen and carbon dioxide binding to hemoglobin. As hemoglobin releases oxygen in the tissues, its affinity for carbon dioxide increases, facilitating CO2 pickup. Conversely, as hemoglobin binds oxygen in the lungs, its affinity for carbon dioxide decreases, promoting CO2 release. This reciprocal relationship optimizes both oxygen delivery and carbon dioxide removal. Acid-base regulation represents a crucial area of respiratory cardiovascular cooperation. The respiratory system provides rapid adjustments to acid-base balance through changes in carbon dioxide elimination, while the cardiovascular system transports acids and bases between tissues and eliminates organs. The kidneys provide slower but more sustained acid-base regulation, with the cardiovascular system delivering filtered substances to the kidneys and carrying away the products of renal acid-base regulation. Pathological conditions often affect both respiratory and cardiovascular systems simultaneously, highlighting their interdependence. Heart failure can cause pulmonary edema, impairing gas exchange and requiring compensatory changes in breathing patterns. Conversely, severe lung disease can lead to pulmonary hypertension and right heart failure as the cardiovascular system struggles to overcome increased pulmonary vascular resistance. The concept of oxygen debt illustrates the integrated response of both systems to metabolic demands that exceed immediate oxygen supply. During intense exercise, oxygen consumption may exceed oxygen delivery, leading to anaerobic metabolism and lactate production. Both respiratory and cardiovascular systems continue to work at elevated levels after exercise ends, paying back this oxygen debt and clearing accumulated metabolic byproducts. Temperature regulation provides another example of respiratory cardiovascular coordination. During heat stress, both systems contribute to cooling. The respiratory system increases ventilation to enhance evaporative heat loss through breathing, while the cardiovascular system increases blood flow to the skin to enhance convective and radiative heat loss. During cold stress, both systems help conserve heat through reduced ventilation to minimize heat loss from breathing and reduced blood flow to extremities. The development of both systems during growth and their changes during aging show coordinated patterns that maintain functional integration throughout life. During childhood, both respiratory and cardiovascular systems increase in capacity roughly proportional to body size and metabolic demands. During aging, both systems show gradual declines in function, but their coordinated changes usually maintain adequate gas transport for normal activities. Understanding the respiratory cardiovascular partnership provides insights into why physical fitness has such profound health benefits. Regular exercise enhances the function of both systems and improves their coordination, increasing the efficiency of oxygen transport and carbon dioxide removal. This enhanced efficiency provides greater functional reserve and better adaptation to physiological challenges. The intimate partnership between respiratory and circulatory systems exemplifies the integrated nature of human physiology. Neither system can function effectively in isolation. Their coordination is essential for the fundamental process of cellular respiration that sustains life. Chapter 0: The Invisible Dance. Every moment of your life, whether awake or asleep, your body performs an extraordinary feat that requires no conscious thought breathing. This automatic rhythm sustains every cell, powers every heartbeat, and enables every word you speak. Right now, as you settle in to listen, your diaphragm is silently contracting, drawing air through an intricate network of passages into microscopic chambers where the alchemy of life unfolds. Oxygen slips across impossibly thin membranes into your bloodstream, while carbon dioxide makes the return journey, each exchange happening thousands of times without your awareness. Tonight, we'll explore the remarkable machinery that keeps this vital process running seamlessly from your first breath to your last. Every molecule of oxygen that sustains your life must complete an extraordinary voyage, traveling from the air you breathe through a sophisticated transport system to reach the mitochondria of cells throughout your body. This journey, repeated billions of times with each breath, represents one of biology's most elegant solutions to the fundamental challenge of delivering a vital resource from the external environment to the innermost reaches of a complex organism. The journey begins at the respiratory membrane, where oxygen molecules dissolve into the thin layer of fluid lining the alveoli before diffusing across the alveolar wall into the blood. This initial step, seemingly simple, involves overcoming several barriers and depends on precise physical and chemical conditions. The oxygen must first dissolve in the surfactant-containing fluid that coats the alveolar surface, then cross the alveolar epithelium, traverse the basement membrane, and finally cross the capillary endothelium to enter the bloodstream. Once oxygen enters the blood, it faces a critical choice point that determines its fate and effectiveness. A small portion, only about 1.5% under normal conditions, remains dissolved directly in the plasma, following Henry's law, which governs gas solubility in liquids. This dissolved oxygen provides an immediately available reservoir that can diffuse rapidly into tissues, but its limited quantity makes it insufficient to meet the body's metabolic demands. The vast majority of oxygen, approximately 98.5%, binds to hemoglobin, the remarkable protein that serves as the primary oxygen transport vehicle in blood. Hemoglobin's ability to carry oxygen depends on its unique molecular structure which represents a masterpiece of evolutionary engineering refined over millions of years to optimize oxygen transport under the varying conditions encountered in complex organisms. Each hemoglobin molecule consists of four protein subunits called globins, each containing a heme group at its center. The heme group houses an iron atom that serves as the actual oxygen binding site. This iron atom can reversibly bind one oxygen molecule, meaning each complete hemoglobin molecule can carry up to four oxygen molecules. This modular design provides both high oxygen carrying capacity and the flexibility needed for efficient oxygen loading and unloading. The binding of oxygen to hemoglobin follows a sophisticated pattern known as cooperative binding, which creates the characteristic shaped oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. This curve represents one of physiology's most important graphs, describing how hemoglobin's oxygen saturation changes with oxygen pressure. The curve's shape reflects the cooperative interactions between hemoglobin's four oxygen binding sites, where the binding of each oxygen molecule makes it easier for subsequent molecules to bind. At the high oxygen pressures found in healthy lungs, typically around 100 mmHg, hemoglobin becomes approximately 97-98% saturated with oxygen. This high saturation ensures that blood leaving the lungs carries near maximum oxygen loads under normal conditions. The plateau region of the dissociation curve provides an important safety margin, maintaining high oxygen saturation even if lung function is somewhat impaired or atmospheric pressure is reduced. As oxygen-rich blood travels through the circulatory system, it maintains its high oxygen content until reaching the tissue capillaries, where local conditions favor oxygen release. The lower oxygen pressures in tissues, typically 40 mmHg or less, place hemoglobin on the steep portion of the dissociation curve, where small decreases in oxygen pressure cause large decreases in hemoglobin saturation. This steep region ensures efficient oxygen unloading in tissues while maintaining adequate oxygen reserves for transport. The oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve can shift in response to local conditions, providing a mechanism for fine-tuning oxygen delivery to match tissue needs. The Bohr effect describes how decreased pH, increased acidity, shifts the curve rightward, reducing hemoglobin's oxygen affinity and promoting oxygen release. This effect is particularly beneficial in metabolically active tissues, where increased carbon dioxide production creates local acidosis that enhances oxygen delivery precisely where it's needed most. Temperature also affects the oxygen-hemoglobin relationship, with higher temperatures reducing oxygen affinity and promoting oxygen release. This temperature effect helps deliver more oxygen to metabolically active tissues that generate heat, while conserving oxygen in cooler regions of the body. During fever, this effect helps ensure adequate oxygen delivery despite increased metabolic demands. The organic phosphate 2, 3-bisphosphoglycerate 2, 3-BPG, provides another mechanism for regulating oxygen affinity. Red blood cells produce this compound as part of their glucose metabolism, and it binds to hemoglobin in a way that reduces oxygen affinity. Increases in 2,3-BPG levels, which occur during conditions such as anemia, high-altitude exposure, or chronic hypoxia, shift the dissociation curve rightward and enhance oxygen delivery to tissues. Carbon monoxide presents a dramatic example of how disruptions to oxygen transport can be life-threatening. Carbon monoxide binds to hemoglobin with an affinity approximately 200 times greater than oxygen, forming carboxyhemoglobin that cannot carry oxygen, even small amounts of carbon monoxide can significantly reduce blood oxygen carrying capacity, explaining why carbon monoxide poisoning is so dangerous despite the gas being odorless and initially causing few symptoms. Fetal hemoglobin demonstrates the remarkable adaptability of the oxygen transport system to different physiological conditions. Fetal hemoglobin has a higher oxygen affinity than adult hemoglobin, allowing efficient oxygen transfer from maternal blood across the placenta. This higher affinity ensures that the fetus can extract oxygen from maternal blood, even though fetal oxygen pressures are much lower than those found in air breathing adults. The transition from fetal to adult hemoglobin occurs gradually after birth, typically completing by 6 months of age. This transition represents one of many physiological adaptations required for the change from intrauterine life, where oxygen comes from maternal blood, to extrauterine life, where oxygen must be extracted from air through the lungs. Red blood cell production and regulation ensure that adequate hemoglobin is available for oxygen transport. The hormone erythropoietin, produced primarily by the kidneys in response to tissue hypoxia, stimulates red blood cell production in the bone marrow. This feedback system increases oxygen carrying capacity when tissue oxygen delivery is inadequate, providing a long-term adaptation mechanism that complements the immediate adjustments possible through changes in hemoglobin oxygen affinity. The lifespan of red blood cells, approximately 120 days, requires continuous replacement to maintain oxygen transport capacity. Old red blood cells are removed by the spleen and liver, with their iron recycled for use in new hemoglobin synthesis. This recycling system conserves the iron needed for oxygen transport while ensuring that aged cells with reduced oxygen carrying capacity are replaced. Oxygen delivery to tissues depends not only on blood oxygen content, but also on blood flow rate and the efficiency of oxygen extraction. Cardiac output determines how rapidly oxygen-rich blood circulates through the body, while local blood flow regulation ensures that oxygen delivery matches regional metabolic demands. During exercise, increased cardiac output combines with redistribution of blood flow to deliver more oxygen to working muscles. The final step in oxygen's journey occurs at the tissue level, where oxygen must diffuse from capillary blood into cells and ultimately reach the mitochondria, where cellular respiration occurs. This diffusion depends on pressure gradients between blood and tissues, the distance oxygen must travel, and the oxygen consumption rate of the tissues. Capillary density varies among different tissues, reflecting their metabolic demands and oxygen requirements. Highly metabolic tissues, such as cardiac muscle and brain, have dense capillary networks that minimize diffusion distances and ensure adequate oxygen delivery. Less metabolic tissues have sparser capillary networks that still meet their lower oxygen demands while requiring less cardiovascular investment. The concept of oxygen extraction ratio describes how efficiently tissues remove oxygen from the blood, perfusing them. At rest, most tissues extract only about 25% of the oxygen delivered to them, leaving a substantial reserve that can be utilized during increased metabolic demand. During intense exercise, oxygen extraction can increase to 85% or more in working muscles, demonstrating the system's capacity for adaptation. Myoglobin, found in muscle cells, provides an oxygen storage mechanism that supplements delivery from blood. Myoglobin has a higher oxygen affinity than hemoglobin and acts as an oxygen reservoir that releases oxygen when tissue oxygen pressures fall very low. This system is particularly important in cardiac muscle, where myoglobin helps maintain oxygen availability during the compression phase of each heartbeat when coronary blood flow is reduced. The regulation of cellular oxygen consumption involves sophisticated mechanisms that match energy production to energy demands. Mitochondria can adjust their oxygen consumption based on the availability of substrates, the energy demands of the cell, and local oxygen concentrations. This regulation ensures efficient use of delivered oxygen while preventing waste or dangerous accumulation of metabolic byproducts. Understanding oxygen transport helps explain why certain conditions cause characteristic symptoms. Anemia reduces oxygen carrying capacity, leading to fatigue and exercise intolerance as tissues struggle to receive adequate oxygen despite normal lung and heart function. Carbon monoxide poisoning impairs oxygen transport despite normal breathing and circulation, causing tissue hypoxia that can be rapidly fatal. High altitude exposure challenges the oxygen transport system by reducing the driving pressure for oxygen loading in the lungs. The body's adaptations to altitude, including increased ventilation, increased cardiac output, and eventually increased red blood cell production, all serve to maintain adequate oxygen delivery despite reduced atmospheric oxygen pressure. The remarkable efficiency of oxygen transport under normal conditions provides substantial reserve capacity that becomes crucial during illness or stress. This reserve explains why people can tolerate significant reductions in lung function, cardiac output, or hemoglobin levels before experiencing symptoms, and why the body can dramatically increase oxygen delivery during exercise or other demanding situations. Oxygen's journey from atmosphere to mitochondria illustrates the elegant integration of multiple physiological systems working together to sustain life. The respiratory system extracts oxygen from air, the cardiovascular system transports it throughout the body, and hemoglobin provides the crucial link that makes efficient transport possible. As we prepare to explore carbon dioxide's return journey, we appreciate how this outbound voyage sets the stage for the equally important process of waste removal. While oxygen's journey from lungs to tissues captures much attention, the return voyage of carbon dioxide from tissues to lungs represents an equally sophisticated and arguably more complex transport process. Carbon dioxide, the principal waste product of cellular metabolism, must be efficiently removed from tissues and delivered to the lungs for elimination. This return journey involves multiple transport mechanisms, intricate chemical transformations, and precise coordination between respiratory and cardiovascular systems to maintain the delicate acid-base balance essential for life. Carbon dioxide's journey begins at the cellular level, where it forms continuously as a byproduct of cellular respiration. In the mitochondria, the final steps of glucose and fat metabolism produce carbon dioxide as organic molecules are completely oxidized to extract their chemical energy. This carbon dioxide production is directly proportional to metabolic activity. Working muscles produce carbon dioxide rapidly, while resting tissues generate it at much lower rates. Unlike oxygen, which faces significant solubility limitations in blood, carbon dioxide is remarkably soluble in aqueous solutions, being about 20 times more soluble than oxygen. This high solubility means that carbon dioxide can dissolve readily in the intracellular fluid, cross cell membranes easily, and enter the bloodstream without the elaborate transport mechanisms required for oxygen. However, this same solubility creates challenges for carbon dioxide elimination if transport mechanisms become impaired. Once carbon dioxide enters the bloodstream, it travels by three distinct pathways, each contributing to the total carbon dioxide transport and each offering different advantages for maintaining efficient elimination and acid base balance. Understanding these three pathways reveals the elegant redundancy and fine control mechanisms that characterize carbon dioxide transport. The simplest pathway involves carbon dioxide dissolved directly in blood plasma, accounting for approximately 7 to 10% of total carbon dioxide transport. This dissolved carbon dioxide follows Henry's law, with the amount dissolved being directly proportional to the carbon dioxide pressure in blood. While this represents the smallest fraction of carbon dioxide transport, dissolved carbon dioxide is immediately available for diffusion across the respiratory membrane in the lungs, making it important for rapid adjustments in carbon dioxide elimination. The second pathway involves carbon dioxide binding directly to amino groups in proteins, particularly the amino groups in hemoglobin, forming compounds called carbaminohemoglobin. This pathway accounts for approximately 2,025% of carbon dioxide transport and provides important advantages in terms of transport efficiency and regulation. Carbon dioxide binding to hemoglobin is influenced by the oxygenation state of hemoglobin, creating important interactions between oxygen and carbon dioxide transport. The Haldane effect describes the crucial interaction between oxygen and carbon dioxide binding to hemoglobin. Deoxygenated hemoglobin has a higher affinity for carbon dioxide than oxygenated hemoglobin, facilitating carbon dioxide pickup in tissues where oxygen is being released. Conversely, when hemoglobin binds oxygen in the lungs, its affinity for carbon dioxide decreases, promoting carbon dioxide release. This reciprocal relationship optimizes both oxygen delivery and carbon dioxide removal, demonstrating the elegant integration of gas transport mechanisms. The third and quantitatively most important pathway involves the conversion of carbon dioxide to bicarbonate ions, accounting for approximately 65–70% of total carbon dioxide transport. This pathway involves a series of chemical reactions that occur primarily within red blood cells and involves the crucial enzyme carbonic anhydrase, one of the fastest enzymes known to biochemistry. When carbon dioxide enters red blood cells, it reacts with water in the presence of carbonic anhydrase to form carbonic acid. This reaction occurs rapidly due to the enzyme's extraordinary catalytic efficiency. Each carbonic anhydrase molecule can catalyze the formation of up to 1 million carbonic acid molecules per second. Without this enzyme, the reaction would proceed far too slowly to support life's metabolic demands. The carbonic acid, formed by this reaction, immediately dissociates into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. The hydrogen ions are buffered by hemoglobin and other proteins within the red blood cell, preventing dangerous changes in intracellular pH. The bicarbonate ions, being charged and unable to cross the cell membrane easily, are exchanged for chloride ions through a specific transport protein called the chloride bicarbonate exchanger, or BAN3 protein. This chloride shift, also known as the hamburger shift, allows bicarbonate ions to move from red blood cells into plasma, while chloride ions move in the opposite direction to maintain electrical neutrality. The result is that plasma bicarbonate concentration increases as blood travels from tissues to lungs, providing a large reservoir for carbon dioxide transport that doesn't directly affect blood pH. The bicarbonate buffer system represents the most important buffering system in blood, helping maintain pH within the narrow range required for optimal physiological function. The relationship between carbon dioxide, bicarbonate, and pH is described by the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation, which shows how changes in carbon dioxide levels or bicarbonate concentrations affect blood pH. This buffering system provides both immediate protection against pH changes and a mechanism for long-term pH regulation through coordination between respiratory and renal systems. The respiratory system can rapidly adjust carbon dioxide levels through changes in ventilation, while the kidneys can more slowly adjust bicarbonate levels through changes in renal acid-base handling. As carbon dioxide rich blood returns to the lungs, the transport processes reverse to facilitate carbon dioxide elimination. In the pulmonary capillaries, the high oxygen levels and low carbon dioxide levels in alveolar air create conditions that favor carbon dioxide release and oxygen uptake. The Haldane effect again plays a crucial role, as hemoglobin's binding of oxygen reduces its affinity for carbon dioxide, promoting carbon dioxide release. The bicarbonate ions in plasma re-enter red blood cells in exchange for chloride ions, reversing the chloride shift that occurred in tissue capillaries. Within red blood cells, bicarbonate ions combine with hydrogen ions to form carbonic acid, which is then converted back to carbon dioxide and water by carbonic anhydrase. The carbon dioxide can then diffuse across the respiratory membrane into alveolar air for elimination. Temperature effects on carbon dioxide transport complement those affecting oxygen transport. Higher temperatures increase carbon dioxide production in tissues, while also reducing carbon dioxide solubility in blood and decreasing the efficiency of the carbonic anhydrase reaction. These effects tend to promote carbon dioxide elimination in warm tissues while facilitating carbon dioxide retention in cooler regions. The coordinated regulation of carbon dioxide transport and elimination provides precise control over acid-base balance. Even small changes in carbon dioxide levels can significantly affect blood pH, making the regulation of carbon dioxide transport crucial for maintaining physiological function. The respiratory control system continuously adjusts ventilation to maintain appropriate carbon dioxide levels, while the cardiovascular system adjusts blood flow to optimize carbon dioxide removal from tissues. Exercise provides an excellent example of how carbon dioxide transport adapts to changing metabolic demands. During physical activity, carbon dioxide production increases dramatically in working muscles. The increased carbon dioxide levels in muscle tissue promote carbon dioxide loading into blood through all three transport pathways. The resulting increase in blood carbon dioxide levels stimulates increased ventilation, which enhances carbon dioxide elimination and helps maintain normal blood pH despite increased carbon dioxide production. The efficiency of carbon dioxide transport is such that even during intense exercise, when carbon dioxide production may increase 10 to 20-fold above resting levels, blood carbon dioxide levels typically increase only modestly. This remarkable regulatory capacity demonstrates the effectiveness of the integrated transport and control mechanisms. Pathological conditions can disrupt carbon dioxide transport and elimination, leading to characteristic disturbances in acid-base balance. Respiratory acidosis occurs when carbon dioxide elimination is impaired, leading to carbon dioxide retention and decreased blood pH. This can result from lung disease, respiratory muscle weakness, or depression of respiratory control centers. Respiratory alkalosis occurs when carbon dioxide elimination exceeds production, leading to carbon dioxide depletion and increased blood pH. This can result from hyperventilation due to anxiety, fever, or inappropriate mechanical ventilation. The symptoms of respiratory alkalosis, including dizziness, tingling, and muscle spasms, illustrate the importance of maintaining appropriate carbon dioxide levels. Metabolic acidosis and alkalosis represent disturbances in acid-base balance that originate outside the respiratory system but require respiratory compensation. In metabolic acidosis, increased acid production or decreased acid elimination leads to decreased blood pH, stimulating increased ventilation to eliminate excess carbon dioxide and partially compensate for the acidosis. In metabolic alkalosis, the opposite occurs, with decreased ventilation helping to retain carbon dioxide and partially compensate for the alkalosis. The measurement of blood gases provides important clinical information about carbon dioxide transport and acid-base status. Arterial blood gas analysis typically measures pH, carbon dioxide pressure, and bicarbonate concentration, providing a comprehensive assessment of acid-base balance. Venous blood gas analysis can provide information about tissue carbon dioxide production and transport efficiency. Carbon dioxide transport also plays important roles beyond waste elimination. Carbon dioxide levels help regulate blood flow to various organs, with increased carbon dioxide causing vasodilation and improved blood flow. In the brain, carbon dioxide is a potent regulator of cerebral blood flow, helping ensure adequate oxygen delivery during periods of increased metabolic activity. The development of carbon dioxide transport mechanisms during growth and their changes during aging reflect the system's adaptation to changing physiological demands. Newborns have relatively immature carbon dioxide transport systems that must adapt rapidly to air breathing, while aging can affect the efficiency of carbon dioxide elimination through changes in lung function and cardiovascular performance. Understanding carbon dioxide transport helps explain why acid-base disorders can be so serious and why respiratory and kidney diseases often have complex effects on overall physiological function. The intimate relationship between carbon dioxide transport and pH regulation means that disturbances in carbon dioxide handling can affect every organ system in the body. Carbon dioxide's return journey from tissues to lungs demonstrates the sophisticated integration required for efficient waste elimination while maintaining physiological balance. This process, occurring millions of times daily, ensures that the waste products of cellular metabolism are efficiently removed while preserving the chemical conditions necessary for optimal cellular function. As we transition to exploring the respiratory system's defense mechanisms, we carry with us an appreciation for how effective waste removal is just as crucial as efficient oxygen delivery for sustaining life. The respiratory system faces a constant barrage of potential threats from the external environment. With every breath, you inhale not just life-sustaining oxygen, but also a complex mixture of particles, pathogens, chemicals, and irritants that could pose serious risks to the delicate gas exchange surfaces deep within your lungs. The fact that you can breathe safely in environments containing dust, pollen, bacteria, viruses, and countless other potential hazards is testament to one of biology's most sophisticated defense systems, a multi-layered network of protective mechanisms that work tirelessly to maintain the integrity and function of your post respiratory tract. The first line of defense begins before air even enters your body with the strategic design of the upper respiratory tract itself. The nose, with its complex internal structure, serves as more than just an entrance to the respiratory system. It functions as a sophisticated air filtration and conditioning system that begins the process of making inhaled air safe for the delicate structures downstream. The nostrils contain coarse hairs that trap the largest particles, dust, debris, and small insects that might otherwise enter the respiratory tract. These hairs, called vibrissae, are strategically positioned to create turbulent airflow that forces particles to contact the nasal walls rather than travel directly into the deeper airways. This mechanical filtration removes particles larger than about 10 micrometers in diameter, including most pollen grains and many bacteria. As air travels deeper into the nasal cavity, it encounters increasingly sophisticated defense mechanisms. The nasal conchae create turbulent airflow patterns that ensure maximum contact between inhaled air and the respiratory epithelium lining the nasal passages. This epithelium represents a remarkable biological filter combining mechanical, chemical, and immunological defense mechanisms in a single tissue layer. The respiratory epithelium is lined with countless microscopic hairs called cilia, each about 6 micrometers in length and beating in coordinated waves approximately 1,000 times per minute. These cilia are bathed in a 2-layer mucus system that represents one of the most elegant filtering mechanisms in biology. The deeper periciliary layer, with low viscosity, allows the cilia to beat freely, while the upper gel layer traps particles and pathogens that contact it. The coordinated beating of cilia creates a conveyor belt-like action known as the mucociliary escalator, which continuously moves mucus and trapped particles upward and outward from the respiratory tract. This system can clear particles from the nose and upper airways within minutes, while clearance from the lower airways typically takes hours. The efficiency of this system is such that under normal conditions, very few inhaled particles reach the alveolar level. The mucus itself is far more than a simple sticky trap. It contains a sophisticated arsenal of antimicrobial substances that actively combat potential pathogens. Lysozyme, an enzyme that breaks down bacterial cell walls, provides broad-spectrum antibacterial protection. Lactoferrin binds iron, depriving bacteria of this essential nutrient and inhibiting their growth. Secretory immunoglobulin A, IgA, provides specific immune protection against pathogens that the body has previously encountered. Defensins, small antimicrobial peptides produced by epithelial cells, provide another layer of chemical defense. These molecules can kill bacteria, viruses, and fungi through direct membrane disruption, while also serving as signaling molecules that alert the immune system to potential threats. The concentration and types of defensins vary throughout the respiratory tract, providing targeted protection appropriate to local conditions and threat levels. The mucus also contains antioxidants that protect the respiratory epithelium from damage by reactive oxygen species and other toxic substances. Glutathione, vitamin C, and vitamin E help neutralize harmful chemicals and prevent oxidative damage to the cells lining the airways. This antioxidant protection is particularly important in polluted environments or when the respiratory system is under stress. Beyond the upper respiratory tract, the branching airways of the lungs continue the filtering and defense process. The progressive narrowing of airways from trachea to bronchioles creates increasingly efficient particle filtration, with smaller particles being removed at deeper levels of the respiratory tree. Particles between 1 and 5 micrometers in diameter are typically deposited in the small airways, while only particles smaller than 1 micrometer regularly reach the alveolar level. The ciliated epithelium extends throughout the conducting airways, maintaining the mucociliary escalator system all the way to the terminal bronchioles. The efficiency of this system means that most inhaled particles are cleared from the lungs within 24 hours, preventing accumulation that could interfere with gas exchange or cause inflammatory responses. Alveolar macrophages possess sophisticated mechanisms for identifying and responding to threats. They can distinguish between harmless particles and potential pathogens through pattern recognition receptors that detect molecular signatures associated with bacteria, viruses, and other threats. When activated by pathogen recognition, macrophages release signaling molecules that recruit additional immune cells and initiate inflammatory responses designed to eliminate the threat. The surfactant system provides additional defense functions beyond its crucial role in maintaining alveolar stability. Surfactant proteins, particularly surfactant protein ASPA and surfactant protein D, have antimicrobial properties and can bind to bacteria and viruses, facilitating their removal by alveolar macrophages. These proteins also help regulate immune responses in the alveoli, promoting clearance of pathogens while preventing excessive inflammation that could damage the delicate gas exchange surfaces. The respiratory system also employs powerful reflex mechanisms to protect against inhaled threats. The cough reflex represents one of the most important protective responses, capable of generating air velocities up to 500 miles per hour to expel irritants and foreign materials from the airways. Coughing involves a complex sequence of respiratory muscle contractions coordinated by specialized neural circuits in the brainstem. The cough reflex begins with stimulation of irritant receptors scattered throughout the airways. These receptors respond to mechanical stimulation, chemical irritants, and inflammatory mediators. When activated, they send signals to the cough center in the medulla, which coordinates the complex sequence of muscle contractions that produce an effective cough. The process involves a deep inspiration, closure of the glottis, while expiratory muscles contract to build pressure, then sudden opening of the glottis to produce the explosive airflow that clears the airways. Sneezing provides similar protection for the upper respiratory tract, with irritant receptors in the nasal cavity triggering a reflex that can expel particles and irritants at velocities exceeding 100 miles per hour. The sneeze reflex involves coordination between respiratory muscles and muscles of the face and mouth to create the characteristic pattern of air expulsion that clears the nasal passages. Breath holding and altered breathing patterns provide additional protective responses to airborne threats. When dangerous gases or high concentrations of irritants are detected, reflexes can temporarily halt breathing or alter breathing patterns to minimize exposure. These responses buy time for other protective mechanisms to act or for the threat to be removed from the environment. The immune system provides both innate and adaptive immune responses within the respiratory tract. Innate immunity involves immediate, nonspecific responses to potential threats, while adaptive immunity develops specific responses to particular pathogens based on previous exposure. The respiratory tract contains specialized immune tissues, including mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue, MALT, that serve as local immune command centers. Dendritic cells scattered throughout the respiratory epithelium serve as sentinels that sample the antigenic environment and present information about potential threats to other immune cells. These cells can initiate adaptive immune responses when they encounter pathogens, leading to the development of specific immunity that provides long lasting protection against future exposures to the same threats. The inflammatory response represents a double edged sword in respiratory defense. While inflammation helps eliminate threats and promote healing, excessive or prolonged inflammatory responses can damage the respiratory tract and impair its function. The respiratory system has evolved sophisticated mechanisms for regulating inflammatory responses, promoting effective defense while limiting collateral damage. Environmental factors significantly influence the effectiveness of respiratory defense mechanisms. Air pollution can overwhelm the filtering capacity of the upper airways and impair ciliary function, reducing the effectiveness of the mucociliary escalator. Cigarette smoke contains numerous toxic substances that damage ciliated epithelium and impair immune function, explaining why smokers are more susceptible to respiratory infections. Cold, dry air can reduce the effectiveness of mucus as a filtering medium and slow ciliary beating, potentially compromising respiratory defenses. This helps explain why respiratory infections are more common during winter months when indoor heating creates dry air conditions that stress the respiratory defense systems. Age affects respiratory defense mechanisms in important ways. Newborns have relatively immature immune systems and may lack specific immunity to common respiratory pathogens, making them more vulnerable to respiratory infections. Elderly individuals may experience decline in ciliary function, reduced immune responsiveness, and decreased effectiveness of protective reflexes, increasing their susceptibility to respiratory diseases. Genetic factors influence individual variation in respiratory defense capabilities. Some people have more effective mucus production or enhanced immune responses, while others may have genetic variants that make them more susceptible to respiratory infections or less effective at clearing inhaled particles. Understanding these individual differences helps explain why people vary in their susceptibility to respiratory diseases and their responses to environmental challenges. The remarkable efficiency of respiratory defense systems under normal conditions provides a crucial safety margin that allows humans to survive in diverse environments containing potential respiratory threats. However, when these defense systems are overwhelmed by excessive exposure, impaired by disease, or compromised by genetic factors, respiratory problems can develop that illustrate just how important these protective mechanisms are for maintaining health. Chronic exposure to pollutants or irritants can lead to persistent inflammation and progressive damage to defense mechanisms, potentially resulting in chronic respiratory diseases. Understanding how these defense systems work and what factors can compromise them provides important insights into prevention and treatment of respiratory disorders. The sophisticated, multi-layered defense systems of the respiratory tract demonstrate the critical importance of protecting the gas exchange surfaces that sustain life. These mechanisms work continuously and largely invisibly to ensure that the air reaching your alveoli is clean, appropriately conditioned, and free from harmful substances. As we prepare to explore what happens when respiratory function is compromised, we carry with us an appreciation for the remarkable protective systems that usually keep breathing safe and effortless. Chapter 0. The Invisible Dance. Every moment of your life, whether awake or asleep, your body performs an extraordinary feat that requires no conscious thought breathing. This automatic rhythm sustains every cell, powers every heartbeat, and enables every word you speak. Right now, as you settle in to listen, your diaphragm is silently contracting, drawing air through an intricate network of passages into microscopic chambers where the alchemy of life unfolds. Oxygen slips across impossibly thin membranes into your bloodstream, while carbon dioxide makes the return journey, each exchange happening thousands of times without your awareness. Tonight, we'll explore the remarkable machinery that keeps this vital process running seamlessly from your first breath to your last. Throughout most of life, breathing remains an effortless, automatic process that requires no conscious attention. Yet this apparent simplicity masks the intricate mechanisms we've explored, and when any component of the respiratory system falters, the consequences can range from mild discomfort to life-threatening emergencies. Understanding how common respiratory challenges affect normal breathing function reveals both the vulnerabilities inherent in this complex system and the remarkable resilience that allows many people to maintain adequate respiratory function even when faced with significant disease. Asthma represents one of the most common respiratory disorders, affecting hundreds of millions of people worldwide and illustrating how the normally protective mechanisms of the airways can become problematic when overstimulated. In asthma, the smooth muscle surrounding the bronchi and bronchioles becomes hyperresponsive to triggers such as allergens, irritants, exercise, or emotional stress. When exposed to these triggers, the airway smooth muscle contracts excessively, dramatically narrowing the airways and making breathing difficult. The pathophysiology of asthma involves more than simple muscle contraction. Inflammatory responses cause swelling of the airway walls, further reducing the diameter available for airflow. Excessive mucus production can create plugs that block airways entirely in some regions. The combination of bronchospasm, inflammation, and mucus plugging creates the characteristic symptoms of asthma: wheezing, coughing, chest tightness, and shortness of breath. During an asthma attack, the increased resistance to airflow means that breathing requires much more effort than normal. The work of breathing can increase dramatically, with patients sometimes using accessory respiratory muscles and adopting characteristic postures that help optimize airflow. The wheeze sound characteristic of asthma occurs when air is forced through narrowed airways at high velocity, creating audible turbulence. Asthma particularly affects expiration, as the positive pressure generated during exhalation tends to compress already narrowed airways further. This can lead to air trapping, where air becomes trapped in alveoli because it can enter during inspiration when airways dilate slightly, but cannot exit easily during expiration when airways compress. Over time, this air trapping can lead to hyperinflation of the lungs and changes in chest shape. Chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD, represents a different pattern of respiratory impairment, typically developing over many years in response to chronic exposure to inhaled irritants, most commonly cigarette smoke. COPD encompasses two main conditions that often occur together: chronic bronchitis and emphysema. Both conditions progressively impair the lungs' ability to exchange gases and eliminate carbon dioxide. Chronic bronchitis involves persistent inflammation and thickening of the airways, along with excessive mucus production that can obstruct airflow. The chronic irritation leads to hypertrophy of mucus producing glands and impairment of the mucociliary escalator, making it difficult to clear secretions. Patients often develop a persistent productive cough as the respiratory system attempts to clear the excess mucus. Emphysema involves destruction of the alveolar walls, reducing the surface area available for gas exchange and destroying the elastic recoil that normally drives expiration. As alveolar walls are destroyed, adjacent alveoli merge to form larger, less efficient air spaces called bullae. The loss of elastic recoil makes expiration more difficult, leading to air trapping and progressive hyperinflation of the lungs. The combination of airway obstruction and loss of elastic recoil in COPD creates characteristic breathing patterns. Patients often develop pursed lip breathing, where they breathe out slowly through partially closed lips to maintain positive pressure in the airways and prevent collapse during expiration. Many adopt a forward-leaning posture that helps optimize the mechanical advantage of respiratory muscles. Pneumonia illustrates how infection can disrupt the delicate gas exchange surfaces of the lungs. When bacteria, viruses, or other pathogens reach the alveoli, they trigger inflammatory responses designed to eliminate the infection. However, this inflammation can fill alveoli with fluid, white blood cells, and debris, creating regions where gas exchange cannot occur effectively. The inflammatory response in pneumonia serves important protective functions by bringing immune cells and antimicrobial substances to the site of infection. However, the same inflammatory mediators that help fight infection also increase capillary permeability, allowing fluid to leak into alveoli. This fluid accumulation, called consolidation, can make entire lung regions non-functional for gas exchange. Patients with pneumonia often experience rapid, shallow breathing as the respiratory system attempts to compensate for reduced gas exchange efficiency. The breathing pattern may become irregular as the control systems struggle to maintain adequate oxygenation despite impaired lung function. Fever, commonly present in pneumonia, increases metabolic demands and carbon dioxide production, further stressing the compromised respiratory system. Sleep apnea represents a different category of respiratory disorder where breathing is disrupted during sleep, illustrating the importance of continuous respiratory control throughout all states of consciousness. Obstructive sleep apnea occurs when the muscles supporting the upper airway relax excessively during sleep, allowing the airway to collapse and block airflow despite continued breathing efforts. During an apneic episode, the person continues to make breathing efforts, but no air can flow through the collapsed airway. Oxygen levels gradually fall, and carbon dioxide levels rise until the accumulated respiratory drive becomes strong enough to trigger awakening. The person partially awakens, muscle tone returns to the upper airway, the obstruction clears, and breathing resumes with characteristic loud snoring or gasping sounds. Central sleep apnea involves dysfunction of the respiratory control centers in the brainstem, leading to periods where breathing efforts simply stop. This condition illustrates the critical importance of the automatic breathing control mechanisms we explored earlier. When these control systems become unstable, breathing can become irregular or cease entirely during sleep. Pulmonary embolism demonstrates how cardiovascular problems can severely impact respiratory function. When blood clots form in leg veins and travel to the lungs, they can block pulmonary arteries and create regions of the lung that are ventilated but not perfused with blood. This ventilation perfusion mismatch creates dead space where air movement occurs, but no gas exchange takes place. The respiratory system's response to pulmonary embolism often includes rapid, shallow breathing as the control systems detect impaired gas exchange and attempt to compensate through increased ventilation. However, because the problem is lack of blood flow rather than inadequate ventilation, increased breathing cannot fully correct the gas exchange impairment. Respiratory muscle weakness illustrates how problems outside the lungs themselves can severely impair breathing. Conditions such as muscular dystrophy, spinal cord injury, or neuromuscular diseases can weaken the diaphragm and other respiratory muscles, making it difficult to generate the pressure changes needed for adequate ventilation. As respiratory muscle strength declines, patients may initially notice difficulty with activities requiring increased ventilation, such as exercise or climbing stairs. The progression of respiratory muscle weakness often follows a predictable pattern. Initially, patients may develop difficulty with forced expiration, making coughing less effective and increasing the risk of respiratory infections. As weakness progresses, inspiratory capacity may decline, leading to shallow breathing and potentially requiring mechanical ventilation support. Interstitial lung diseases represent a group of conditions that thicken the respiratory membrane, making gas diffusion more difficult. Conditions such as pulmonary fibrosis cause scarring and thickening of the tissue between alveoli and capillaries, increasing the distance that oxygen and carbon dioxide must travel during gas exchange. This diffusion impairment particularly affects oxygen uptake, as oxygen diffuses more slowly than carbon dioxide. Patients with interstitial lung disease often develop characteristic breathing patterns with rapid, shallow breaths that help maintain adequate ventilation while minimizing the work of breathing against stiffened lungs. The condition typically progresses gradually, with patients adapting their activity levels and breathing patterns to accommodate their reduced lung function. Lung cancer can affect respiratory function through multiple mechanisms, depending on the location and size of the tumor. Centrally located tumors may obstruct major airways, creating regions of lung collapse or impaired ventilation. Tumors near the pleura may cause fluid accumulation in the pleural space, compressing the lung and impairing expansion. The body's compensatory mechanisms help explain why many people with respiratory diseases can maintain reasonable function despite significant impairment. Increased ventilation can often compensate for mild to moderate gas exchange impairment. The respiratory system can redirect airflow away from diseased regions toward healthier areas. The cardiovascular system can increase cardiac output to enhance oxygen delivery when lung function is compromised. These compensatory mechanisms have limits, however, and understanding these limits helps explain why respiratory diseases often progress gradually before causing severe symptoms. The respiratory system's substantial functional reserve means that significant lung damage can occur before symptoms become apparent, which is why early detection and treatment of respiratory diseases are so important. Individual variation in respiratory reserve and compensatory capacity helps explain why people respond differently to similar degrees of lung impairment. Factors such as age, fitness level, cardiovascular health, and genetics all influence how well someone can tolerate respiratory dysfunction and how effectively their compensatory mechanisms function. The psychological impact of breathing difficulties cannot be overlooked. The sensation of breathlessness or dyspnea can trigger anxiety and panic responses that further compromise respiratory function. The fear of not being able to breathe adequately can create a cycle where anxiety worsens breathing difficulties, which in turn increases anxiety. Understanding this interaction is crucial for comprehensive management of respiratory disorders. Modern medicine offers numerous interventions that can help restore respiratory function or support inadequate breathing. Bronchodilator medications can reverse airway constriction in asthma and COPD. Anti-inflammatory treatments can reduce airway inflammation and fluid accumulation. Supplemental oxygen can help maintain adequate oxygenation when gas exchange is impaired. Mechanical ventilation can support or replace breathing when respiratory muscles are inadequate. The development of these treatments has dramatically improved outcomes for many respiratory conditions, but the fundamental principles remain the same. Effective treatment requires understanding which component of the respiratory system is impaired and how to restore or compensate for that impairment. This understanding builds directly on knowledge of normal respiratory function and the mechanisms we've explored throughout our journey. Respiratory challenges remind us that the apparent simplicity of breathing masks an intricate system where multiple components must function correctly for optimal performance. When any element fails, the consequences illustrate just how remarkable normal respiratory function truly is. As we turn to explore the respiratory system's capacity for healing and regeneration, we appreciate both its vulnerabilities and the resilience that allows recovery from many types of respiratory damage. One of the most remarkable aspects of the respiratory system is its extraordinary capacity for healing and regeneration. Despite constant exposure to potential irritants, pathogens, and environmental challenges, the respiratory tract possesses sophisticated mechanisms for repairing damage, replacing worn-out cells, and restoring function after injury. Research has revealed the existence of alveolar stem cell populations that become activated during injury and contribute to regenerative responses. These cells, including alveolar epithelial progenitor cells and other specialized stem cell types, can proliferate extensively and differentiate into multiple cell types needed for alveolar repair. Understanding these stem cell populations has opened new avenues for potential therapeutic interventions to enhance lung regeneration. The respiratory system's blood vessels also demonstrate impressive regenerative capacity. The pulmonary circulation can develop collateral vessels to bypass blocked or damaged blood vessels, helping maintain blood flow to lung regions that might otherwise be compromised. This angiogenic response involves the sprouting of new capillaries from existing vessels and the recruitment of progenitor cells that can form new blood vessels. During recovery from lung injury, coordinated regeneration of both epithelial and endothelial compartments is essential for restoring normal function. The respiratory epithelium and pulmonary capillaries must regenerate in concert to recreate the intimate relationship needed for efficient gas exchange. This coordination involves complex signaling between different cell types and requires precise timing to ensure optimal outcomes. Age affects regenerative capacity throughout the respiratory system, though the changes are often gradual and may not become apparent until later in life. Younger individuals typically show more rapid and complete regeneration after respiratory injury, while older adults may experience slower healing and potentially incomplete recovery. However, significant regenerative capacity is maintained throughout life, allowing meaningful recovery even in elderly individuals. The molecular mechanisms underlying respiratory regeneration involve complex networks of growth factors, signaling pathways, and transcription factors that coordinate cellular responses to injury. Understanding these mechanisms has revealed potential targets for therapeutic interventions that could enhance the natural regenerative capacity or restore regenerative function when it becomes impaired. Mechanical factors play important roles in respiratory regeneration. Appropriate mechanical stimulation through normal breathing appears to promote healthy regeneration, while mechanical ventilation or altered breathing patterns can affect the quality and extent of regenerative responses. This mechanical sensitivity helps explain why early mobilization and breathing exercises are important components of recovery from respiratory illness or injury. The inflammatory response, while often viewed as problematic in respiratory disease, actually plays crucial roles in initiating and coordinating regenerative responses. Controlled inflammation provides signals that activate stem cells, clear damaged tissue, and coordinate the various cellular responses needed for effective repair. However, excessive or prolonged inflammation can impair regeneration and lead to scarring, highlighting the importance of appropriate inflammatory regulation. Environmental factors significantly influence regenerative capacity. Clean air promotes optimal regeneration, while continued exposure to pollutants or irritants can impair healing responses. Adequate nutrition provides the building blocks and energy needed for cellular regeneration. Regular exercise may enhance regenerative capacity by promoting healthy circulation and cellular turnover. The discovery of lung stem cells has revolutionized understanding of respiratory regeneration and opened new therapeutic possibilities. These cells, located in specialized niches throughout the respiratory tract, can be activated by injury and contribute to regenerative responses. Research into methods for enhancing stem cell function or transplanting stem cells to damaged lungs represents an active area of investigation. Regenerative medicine approaches for respiratory diseases are being developed based on understanding of natural regenerative mechanisms. These include stem cell therapies, tissue engineering approaches that create scaffolds for lung regeneration, and treatments that enhance the body's natural repair mechanisms. While still largely experimental, these approaches offer hope for treating respiratory diseases that currently have limited treatment options. The respiratory system's regenerative capacity provides important insights into maintaining lung health throughout life. Avoiding harmful exposures, maintaining good nutrition, staying physically active, and managing chronic diseases appropriately all support the natural regenerative processes that help maintain respiratory function. Understanding these factors empowers individuals to make choices that support their respiratory health. Perhaps most importantly, the respiratory system's remarkable regenerative capacity provides hope for recovery from respiratory diseases and injuries. Even when significant damage has occurred, the potential for meaningful improvement often exists. This regenerative potential, combined with appropriate medical treatment and supportive care, allows many people to recover substantial respiratory function even after serious respiratory illness or injury. The study of respiratory regeneration continues to reveal new mechanisms and possibilities for therapeutic intervention. As our understanding of these processes deepens, we can expect continued development of treatments that harness and enhance the respiratory system's natural healing capacity. This represents one of the most promising frontiers in respiratory medicine and offers hope for addressing some of the most challenging respiratory diseases. The respiratory system's capacity for regeneration and recovery demonstrates that even the most complex biological systems possess remarkable resilience and healing potential. This regenerative capacity, operating continuously throughout life, helps ensure that the vital function of breathing can be maintained despite the countless challenges and injuries that the respiratory system encounters. As we prepare to explore the broader significance of breathing in our final chapter, we carry with us an appreciation for the respiratory system's remarkable ability to heal, adapt, and restore itself. As our journey through the respiratory system draws to a close, we find ourselves contemplating not just the mechanical processes that move air in and out of our lungs, but the profound significance of breathing in the broader context of human existence. Breathing represents far more than simple gas exchange. It connects us to our environment, influences our emotions, facilitates communication, and serves as a bridge between our conscious and unconscious selves. The respiratory system we've explored in such detail reveals itself to be not merely a collection of anatomical structures, but a fundamental interface between our inner biological world and the vast atmosphere that surrounds our planet. The integration of respiratory function with other body systems demonstrates the interconnected nature of human physiology in ways that continue to reveal new layers of complexity and elegance. We've seen how breathing mechanics coordinate with cardiovascular function to optimize oxygen delivery and carbon dioxide removal. We've explored how the nervous system regulates breathing through both automatic and voluntary mechanisms. We've discovered how chemical feedback systems maintain exquisite control over acid-base balance through respiratory adjustments. But these integrative relationships extend far beyond the physiological mechanisms we've examined. The respiratory system participates in virtually every aspect of human function, from the cellular level where oxygen enables energy production to the social level where breathing enables speech and communication. This broad integration makes breathing central to human life in ways that transcend its basic biological functions. Speech and vocalization represent perhaps the most uniquely human use of the respiratory system. The ability to use exhaled air to create the complex sounds of language has enabled the development of culture, knowledge transmission, and social cooperation that define human civilization. The respiratory control required for speech is remarkably sophisticated, involving precise coordination of breathing patterns with vocal cord positioning and oral movements. Singers and public speakers develop extraordinary control over their respiratory systems, learning to manage airflow and pressure with precision that allows for extended phrases, dynamic control, and emotional expression through voice. This voluntary respiratory control demonstrates the remarkable plasticity of respiratory function and its responsiveness to training and practice. The relationship between breathing and emotional states reveals another dimension of respiratory integration with human experience. Anxiety typically causes rapid, shallow breathing that can lead to hyperventilation and associated symptoms. Fear can cause breath holding or gasping. Relaxation is associated with slow, deep breathing that promotes parasympathetic nervous system activity. These emotional influences on breathing are so consistent that breathing patterns serve as reliable indicators of emotional states. Conversely, voluntary control of breathing can influence emotional states, demonstrating bidirectional communication between respiratory function and emotional regulation. Meditation practices across cultures have developed sophisticated breathing techniques that promote relaxation, concentration, and altered states of consciousness. These practices suggest that breathing serves as a unique bridge between voluntary and involuntary nervous system functions. The role of breathing in meditation and mindfulness practices illustrates its significance in human consciousness and spiritual experience. Many contemplative traditions use breath awareness as a foundation for developing present moment attention and mental clarity. The breath serves as an ideal object of meditation because it's always present, constantly changing, and intimately connected to both body and mind. Breathing techniques, such as pranayama in yoga traditions, breathing meditation in Buddhist practice, and various forms of breath work in contemporary wellness approaches, all recognize the breath as a powerful tool for influencing physical, mental, and emotional states. These practices suggest that conscious breathing can serve therapeutic functions beyond its basic biological role. The automatic nature of breathing provides a unique window into the relationship between conscious and unconscious aspects of human function. While breathing continues automatically without conscious attention, it can also be voluntarily controlled within limits. This dual nature makes breathing a fascinating example of how conscious and unconscious processes interact in human physiology. The fact that breathing continues during sleep, anesthesia, and altered states of consciousness demonstrates the reliability of automatic control mechanisms, while the ability to consciously modify breathing patterns illustrates the flexibility and adaptability of respiratory control. This combination of reliability and adaptability characterizes many of the most successful biological systems. Sleep represents a particularly interesting state for respiratory function, as breathing patterns change significantly during different sleep stages. During REM sleep, breathing becomes irregular and may show patterns that differ markedly from waking breathing. These changes reflect the complex interactions between sleep related brain activity and respiratory control mechanisms. Dreams sometimes include sensations of breathlessness or difficulty breathing, suggesting that respiratory function is integrated into the dream experience. The fact that breathing continues reliably during sleep while still showing sensitivity to dream content illustrates the sophisticated integration between respiratory control and higher brain functions. Physical exercise reveals the remarkable adaptability of respiratory function and its integration with other physiological systems. During intense exercise, breathing rate and depth can increase dramatically to meet the increased oxygen demands and carbon dioxide production of working muscles. The respiratory system's ability to make these adjustments while maintaining stable blood gas levels demonstrates extraordinary physiological integration and control. Trained athletes develop enhanced respiratory efficiency that allows them to sustain high levels of performance. These adaptations include improved respiratory muscle strength and endurance, enhanced breathing control, and better integration between respiratory and cardiovascular responses to exercise. These adaptations illustrate the respiratory system's responsiveness to training and its potential for enhanced performance. The respiratory system's role in maintaining acid-base balance demonstrates its integration with fundamental cellular and metabolic processes. Every cellular reaction in the body depends on appropriate pH conditions, making respiratory regulation of acid-base balance essential for optimal physiological function. The precision with which the respiratory system maintains pH within narrow limits, despite wide variations in metabolic activity, illustrates sophisticated regulatory mechanisms. Temperature regulation represents another area where respiratory function integrates with broader physiological needs. Breathing serves as one mechanism for heat loss through the evaporation of water from respiratory surfaces. During heat stress, increased breathing can contribute to cooling, while during cold exposure, reduced breathing helps conserve heat. These thermal functions demonstrate how respiratory function adapts to serve multiple physiological needs simultaneously. The development of respiratory function from birth through aging shows how this vital system adapts to changing physiological needs throughout life. The transition from fetal circulation to air breathing at birth represents one of the most dramatic physiological adaptations in human development. The respiratory system must be ready to function immediately upon birth, despite having developed in a fluid environment where gas exchange occurred through the placenta. Childhood development involves continued maturation of respiratory control mechanisms and adaptation to growing metabolic demands. Adolescence brings changes in respiratory function that parallel overall physical development. Adulthood typically represents the period of peak respiratory function, while aging brings gradual changes that can affect respiratory efficiency and reserve capacity. Despite age-related changes, the respiratory system typically maintains adequate function for normal activities throughout life, demonstrating remarkable functional reserve and adaptability. Understanding these life course changes helps appreciate both the respiratory system's resilience and the importance of maintaining respiratory health through appropriate lifestyle choices. Environmental factors continue to influence respiratory function throughout life, highlighting the respiratory system's role as an interface between internal physiology and external conditions. Air quality, altitude, humidity, and temperature all affect respiratory function and demonstrate the system's responsiveness to environmental variation. Climate change and air pollution represent contemporary challenges to respiratory health that illustrate the ongoing importance of understanding respiratory function and protecting respiratory health. The respiratory system's remarkable filtering and protective mechanisms provide significant protection against environmental challenges, but these systems have limits and can be overwhelmed by severe or prolonged exposures. The study of respiratory function has contributed significantly to understanding human physiology and has led to important medical advances. Techniques developed for studying breathing have provided insights into many other physiological processes. Treatments developed for respiratory diseases have often found applications in other areas of medicine. The respiratory system serves as a model for understanding how complex biological systems maintain homeostasis while adapting to changing conditions. Future research in respiratory physiology continues to reveal new aspects of respiratory function and its integration with other biological processes. Understanding of stem cell biology and regenerative mechanisms offers hope for treating previously incurable respiratory diseases. Advances in understanding respiratory control mechanisms may lead to new approaches for treating breathing disorders. The molecular mechanisms underlying respiratory function continue to be elucidated, providing insights that may lead to new therapeutic approaches. The role of genetic factors in respiratory health and disease is becoming better understood, offering possibilities for personalized approaches to respiratory care. As we conclude our exploration of the respiratory system, we're struck by the elegant simplicity of breathing combined with the extraordinary complexity of the mechanisms that make it possible. Each breath represents the culmination of millions of years of evolutionary refinement, sophisticated engineering that operates automatically yet responds to conscious control, and integration with virtually every aspect of human physiology and experience. The respiratory system embodies many of the characteristics that make biological systems so remarkable: reliability and adaptability, simplicity and complexity, automatic function and conscious control, individual operation and system integration. Understanding respiratory function provides insights not just into how we breathe, but into how complex biological systems maintain life in a dynamic and challenging world. Perhaps most remarkably, the respiratory system operates continuously throughout life, requiring no conscious attention, yet responding to conscious control, maintaining the precise conditions needed for optimal cellular function while adapting to endless variations in demand and environment. This reliability and adaptability ensure that the fundamental process of breathing continues to sustain life from our first breath to our last. In breathing, we find not just the mechanics of gas exchange, but a profound example of how life maintains itself through constant interaction with the environment, how complex systems achieve reliability through elegant design, and how the automatic processes that sustain life remain intimately connected to conscious experience and voluntary control. The breath of life, in all its complexity and simplicity, continues to sustain and amaze us, breath by breath, moment by moment, throughout the entirety of our existence on this breathing planet.